That's on the top, and we're not here to turn it off then. I know you. Well, we have, oh, this is like open at the same time. Yeah, that red light will come on.
Uh-huh.
The light comes on when you finish these. Press the button on. Yeah. Hey, Sonny. Thank you.
Hello, it's Commissioner Yaki.
Oh, you're welcome. How are you? Turn off my phone. Oh, yeah. Is that your dog, Karen? Oh, no, it's my sister's dog. What kind of dog is he? A mix, but Great Pyrenees. He's adorable. She's very sweet. She's huge, but she likes to cuddle. That's not always a good thing. She's very gentle. I don't know if we have time because we are limiting it to 20 people, but we can actually submit it as written.
Oh, if we've got the
People
time.
can sign, and if we have the time, then yes.
Okay.
This is, but we're cutting it off at our school. But, Pete, yeah, just for the dog. Yeah. I'm going to call us to order at 9 a.m. This briefing of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights comes to order on December 8th, 2017, and takes place at the Commission's headquarters, located at 1331 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest, Washington, D.C. I'm Chair Catherine Lehman. Commissioners present at this briefing, in addition to me, are the Vice Chair, Timmons Goodson, Commissioner Harriet, Commissioner Kursanow, Commissioner Kladny, Commissioner Narasaki. I believe that Commissioner Adegbile is on his way. Commissioner Yaki, could you confirm that you're participating by phone?
Yeah, I'm on the phone.
Thank you. Quorum of the commissioners is present. I see that the court reporter is present. Mr. Staff Director, are you present?
I am, thank you.
Thank you. And welcome everyone here to our briefing titled The School to Prison Pipeline, the Intersections of Students of Color with Disabilities. In today's briefing, the Commission examines federal law and policy on school discipline and civil rights, specifically focused on students of color with disabilities. While this investigation is the first time, the Commission will focus on the particular intersectional identities of students of color with disabilities. This is not the first time the Commission or our state advisory committees have taken up the issue of school discipline. In just the last 2 years, 2 of the Commission's state advisory committees in Oklahoma and Indiana have reported on the school to prison pipeline in those states, including making recommendations with respect to race and disability. The Commission's receipt of these advisory committee reports informed our own decision to conduct an investigation onto this issue, and I'm very grateful to the state advisory committees for their work. In addition, in 2011, the Commission published a unanimous Commission report on school discipline and disparate impact, looking particularly at racially diverse school district responses to Education Department disparate impact work. These are only the most recent publication-specific Commission reviews on the topic of civil rights and school discipline. The Commission and our state advisory committees have also examined the topic in earlier years as well. And of course, in my past life as Assistant Secretary for the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education, I corresponded with Commissioners Harriet and Kursanow in their capacities as commissioners multiple times about their views of the discipline-specific work of the Office for Civil Rights. And I confirmed last evening that that correspondence still lives on the OCR website. This repeated attention to the civil rights implications of school discipline is a snapshot reminder that concern about this topic has persisted over time. In fact, the very first desegregation agreements that the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education monitored when Congress created the office included discipline as a component of desegregation promises, because race-based discrimination in discipline was a concern already 60 years ago, as schools struggled to come to terms with the federal non-discrimination promise. More recent data reported to the Office for Civil Rights in the Civil Rights Data Collection and my experience enforcing federal civil rights laws in schools confirms that the issue of discipline continues to challenge school communities, particularly with respect to students of color and students with disabilities, who very often are the same students. I saw that just 2 weeks ago, the current Office for Civil Rights resolved an investigation of racially discriminatory discipline of Native American students with disabilities in a California school district, finding specifically that the district had violated the civil rights of Native American students with disabilities. OCR noted in that resolution, for example, that a Native American elementary school girl who had had 43 behavioral incidents, of which the school listed 38 as major, and whose teachers noted she had problems focusing and repeated behavioral issues, was not evaluated for disability. OCR found that the district failed to evaluate Native American students for disabilities before significant changes in placement, including changes made for disciplinary reasons. OCR also identified within school disparities in discipline for like behaviors between Native American and white students in this district, including, for example, that a Native American student received a one-day out-of-school suspension for slapping another student on the way to the bus, in what was that student's first disciplinary referral that year, whereas a white student received discipline of conference with the other student and lunch detention for slapping two students on the same day, which were that student's fifth and sixth disciplinary referrals that year. The salience of civil rights concern on this topic over decades, together with findings just 2 weeks ago that a California district violated students' civil rights precisely at the intersection of race and disability, and, as it happens, sex, confirms the critical importance of today's briefing, leading the way for the Commission to make recommendations to the President, Congress, and the American people about appropriate civil rights policy on this issue. I look forward to working with my colleagues to draw conclusions and make recommendations after reviewing the material submitted to the Commission and benefiting from today's briefing. Today's briefing features 9 distinguished speakers who will provide us with an array of viewpoints, as well as the opportunity to hear from the public. The first panel includes policy experts and former government officials who will speak to federal education policy on school discipline. I note here that Commission staff invited current officials from relevant offices within the Departments of Justice and the Department of Education, but they declined to participate in today's briefing. Panel 2 includes researchers and experts on special education and the school-to-prison pipeline. I thank all who have joined us today to focus on this critical topic. Your views help us to fulfill our mission to be the nation's eyes and ears on civil rights. I now pass the mic to Commissioner Narasaki, at whose impetus the Commission decided to take up this important issue.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank our excellent Commission staff for their hard work in putting together today's briefing. This hearing, as Catherine notes, is an important example of the role that our state advisory committees play. Last year, when the Oklahoma State Advisory Committee chair presented their school-to-prison pipeline report at one of our meetings, she shared that while the report focused on race and gender, the committee had received considerable testimony regarding the disproportionate impact of school discipline on students with disabilities, and that the issue warranted further investigation. After my special assistant, Jason Legree, and I talked with several experts, we found that students of color with disabilities face higher disproportionate impact from school discipline practices. For example, Native American, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander and African American boys with disabilities are approximately 2.5 times as likely to be suspended as Caucasian boys with disabilities. Unfortunately, not much research has really focused on this phenomenon. It was for that reason that I proposed that the Commission examine the intersectionality of the impact of school discipline policies on students who experience discrimination due to their race, their disability status, and their status as students of color with a disability. I understand that this might be our first investigation that explicitly takes this intersectional approach on this topic, and I look forward very much to hearing our panelists today. As the chair mentioned, the Commission has held briefings on different aspects of school discipline over the past decade. During that time, our understanding of what many refer to as school-to-prison pipeline has continued to grow, in part because of the efforts of the Department of Education and the Department of Justice to provide guidance and collect data. It's my hope that today's hearing will further raise the visibility of what is happening to students with disabilities in our schools, particularly what's happening to students of color with disabilities, and help shine a light on the best practices and the role that the federal government has to play in ensuring that data is collected to identify potential systemic problems and the best practices are lifted up. Last year, the Commission had a hearing on the inequitable funding of our public schools and how these funding disparities are exacerbated by segregation and the increasing concentration of poverty. That report should be issued next month. We heard testimony outlining the lack of sufficient funding for school counselors, school nurses, manageable class sizes, compensation to retain and attract the most experienced teachers, and necessary training for teachers, all of which is relevant to the ability of our communities to address the challenges that we will be discussing today. I think that we can all agree that every school should be equipped to provide every child, regardless of abilities, color, gender, or orientation, with the tools that they need to thrive and learn, and that teachers have a very challenging and important job. I hope that most of us agree that the fact that some preschools are suspending very young children is a fact requiring our very serious attention. Finally, I commend the chair for her leadership in suggesting that we follow the example of our state advisory committees who provide a public comment during our hearings. I thank our witnesses and those of you who are here today to speak during our open comment period. We will hear a lot of numbers and statistics during the hearing, and while that data is extremely important, it is equally imperative that policymakers and researchers writing about these issues hear how these issues are impacting the classrooms and the lives of our most vulnerable students. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Harris, I also understand you want to speak?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. This is an important issue. I don't think a more important one has come before the Commission. Discipline policy is something our schools have to get right. On the one hand, if disruptive students, regardless of race or disability, are left in the classroom, they can make learning impossible for the rest of students, even dangerous. On the other hand, if students are being needlessly suspended or expelled, that's obviously a problem too. Alas, the evidence is overwhelming that federal policies don't help, that the enforcement activities of the Obama administration's Department of Education and its Dear Colleague letter of January 8th, 2014, have been wrong-headed and, according to surveys of teachers, very unpopular. These policies have overly bureaucratized school discipline and resulted not in more equitable school discipline, but in chaotic classrooms. I don't think there's any doubt that the decisions necessary to maintain order in the classroom are best left to teachers and principals. No, they are not perfect, but they sure beat the federal bureaucracy. Even when federal directives are well-meaning and reasonably nuanced, by the time they reach the foot soldiers on the ground, that is the classroom teachers, any subtlety has vanished. Don't discipline minority students unless it is justified, in quotes there, is naturally understood by school district administrators as don't discipline a minority student unless you are confident that you can persuade some future federal investigator whose judgment you have no reason to trust that it was justified. In turn, this is presented to principals as don't discipline a minority student unless you and your teachers jump through the following time-consuming procedural hoops designed to document to the satisfaction of some future federal investigator whose judgment you have no reason to trust that it was justified. Finally, teachers hear the directive this way: just don't discipline so many students. It will only create giant hassles for everyone. This is the nature of bureaucracy. I believe we are better off trusting our teachers. I think I'll stop there, other than to say that the commission staff and the chairman did want to bring in a Trump administration official on this. The problem here, however, the obvious person to bring in would have been Kenneth Marcus, the nominee for the chair's old post. But alas, Mr. Marcus has not received his vote in the Senate. His hearing was just a couple days ago. So he was not able to testify. Instead, we have, I believe, 4 former administrators from the Obama administration.
Thank you. I'll now turn us to begin our briefing. First, deep thanks to our commission staff who researched and brought today's briefing into being, including Merrick Xavier Breyer, LaShonda Brenson, and Maureen Rudolph, in addition to Teresa Adams, Pam Dunstan, Latrice Fauché, Abir Hamid, Lenora Strasky, Sarah Leigh Sewell, Brian Walsh, and Michelle Yorkman-Ramey for making travel and logistical details for today work. In addition, thank you to two new commission interns, Laura Geverter and Jessica Bunch, for their help today. I caution all speakers, including our commissioners, to refrain from speaking over each other for ease of transcription and to allow for sign language translation, which is to my right. I ask everyone present to please silence your phones and not to take flash photos to minimize health risk to persons present. After the two panels and a lunch break, we will reconvene at 1 p.m. for a public comment period. If you're interested in participating in public comment, during which each person will have up to 3 minutes to speak, we will be honored to hear from you. You may sign up at the registration desk beginning at 9:30 a.m. We will hold the public comment period open for 1 hour, with spots allotted on a first-come, first-served basis. For any member of the public who would like to submit materials for our review, our public record will remain open until Tuesday, January 16, 2018. Materials can be submitted by mail to U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, Office of General Counsel, 1331 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest, Suite 1150, Washington, D.C. 20425, or by email to schooldiscipline@usccr.gov. During the briefing, each panelist will have 7 minutes to speak. After each panel presentation, commissioners will have the opportunity to ask questions within the allotted period of time, and I will recognize commissioners who wish to speak. I will strictly enforce the time limits given to each panelist to present his or her statement, and you may assume we have read your statement, so you do not need to read it to us as your opening remarks. Please do focus your remarks on the topic of our briefing, which is the intersection of race and disability in school discipline. Panelists, please notice the system of warning lights that we have set up. When the light turns from green to yellow, that means 2 minutes remain. When the light turns red, you should stop talking. Please be mindful of the other panelists' time so you don't risk my cutting you off, and my fellow commissioners and I will do our part to keep our questions and comments concise. So now, our first panel, in the order in which they speak, includes Anurima Bhargava, who's Leadership and Government Fellow at the Open Society Foundations and former Chief of the Educational Opportunities Section in the Civil Rights Division at the Justice Department. Next, we'll hear from Eve Hill, Partner at Brown, Goldstein, and Levy, and former Deputy Assistant Attorney General at the Civil Rights Division at the Justice Department. Then Kristen Harper, Senior Policy Specialist for Child Friends and former Senior Policy Advisor for the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services at the Department of Education. And then Rebecca Coakley, Senior Fellow for Disability Policy at the Center for American Progress and former Executive Director of the National Council on Disability. And finally, James Scanlon, an attorney who specializes in the use of statistics in litigation. Ms. Bhargava, please begin. Oh, and I should say that if you can turn your mic off when you're not speaking, then everyone's mic will work. Thanks.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning. Thank you to the Commission for the opportunity to present and share information on the disproportionate discipline of students of color with disabilities, and to highlight the transformational and ongoing work of to combat discrimination and segregation in schools in an effort to provide safe and supportive learning environments for all students. My name is Anurima Bhargava. From 2010 to 2016, I led civil rights enforcement in schools and institutions of higher education as a chief of the Educational Opportunities Section in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. I previously served as director of the education practice at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and as a staff attorney to the New York City Department of Education. I'm currently a Leadership and Government Fellow at the Open Society Foundations, where my focus is on identifying and addressing the trauma that students experience related to racial violence. My testimony today will briefly touch upon what is extensively laid out in my submitted statement. I would particularly commend the commissioners to the discussion of recent federal investigations contained in that statement and the ways that teachers and national education organizations have used and relied on federal tools and resources. A student is suspended for bringing ibuprofen to school. Students are suspended and some even arrested for wearing the wrong color socks. An 8-year-old boy with disabilities is restrained by a police officer using handcuffs after he was being disruptive in class. The handcuffs were placed above the boy's elbows, apparently because they would otherwise have fallen off due to his small size. A 5-year-old girl is handcuffed and shackled for having a temper tantrum in school, and a 10-year-old spends a day in solitary confinement within her school in a room where the floor pads are soaked in urine. These are all examples from recent federal investigations of the use of exclusionary and punitive discipline practices in schools. Unfortunately, the use of exclusionary practices, suspensions, expulsions, referrals to law enforcement, or placement in alternative schools, and of punitive discipline practices like restraint and seclusion are prevalent and widespread in schools across the country. In a recent study by the Council of State Governments in Texas, nearly 6 out of 10 students had been suspended or expelled at least once in 7th through 12th grade. Those percentages were even higher among students with disabilities and students of color. 75% of students with disabilities had been suspended or expelled at least once, and 83% of African American male students, 74% of Latino male students, and 70% of African American female students had been subject to disciplinary action. We know that exclusionary and punitive discipline practices are overused. Students are being excluded from classrooms, referred to law enforcement, or subject to restraint and seclusion largely for minor infractions that simply do not rise to the level of posing an imminent or significant threat to the safety of students or school employees. We also know that the excessive use of exclusionary discipline is bad for students, resulting in missed class time, a decline in classroom engagement and cohesion, and the increased likelihood that students who are suspended or expelled will be retained in grade, drop out, or be placed into the juvenile justice system. The use of practices like restraint and seclusion can be dangerous and even fatal for students. We know that such practices isolate and segregate students from the learning environment, which impacts their academic achievement and ability to engage in both the short and the long term. We know that the excessive use of exclusionary discipline is not only harmful for the students who are disciplined, but has serious and negative collateral consequences, even for the students who are not disciplined. The academic achievement and success of all students is reduced in such punitive context. We know that the use of exclusionary and punitive discipline practices do not make our schools safer. Indeed, disciplinary rates, even among schools with very similar student populations, vary dramatically. Yet there is no evidence that schools with lower disciplinary rates are any less safe. We know that these practices simply do not work and are not necessary. There's no evidence that the use of exclusionary discipline practices is effective at addressing or reducing the problem behaviors that led to its use. And they certainly do not support teachers and students in learning how to behave and positively engage in school. After multiple decades of extensive research and work in schools across the country, we also know what works. Positive behavioral supports and interventions and restorative justice practices, as 2 examples, are educationally and behaviorally sound practices that can have and have extensively been used and used more effectively to address issues that arise in the classroom. In part because of the conversion the convergence of the widespread and pervasive use of disciplinary practices and the improved understanding of what works, that all led to a groundswell in this country. It was a call to action and repeated requests to the federal government on how to best promote positive discipline practices in accordance with federal law. We heard from thousands and thousands of students, parents, teachers, school administrators, school board members, and superintendents, and community organizations who called upon the Departments of Justice, Education, and Health and Human Services for tools and resources, and for the federal government to enforce federal civil rights laws. Exclusionary and punitive discipline practices are not only educationally unsound, when they segregate or discriminate against students of color or students with disabilities, they violate federal civil rights laws. We know these practices disproportionately impact students of color with disabilities. And while these disparities alone do not prove discrimination, the existence of such disparities indicate that students of color and students with disabilities are being disproportionately disciplined and raise questions regarding whether schools are imposing such discipline in a discriminatory manner and violation of federal civil rights laws. It is the job of the Departments of Justice and Education to investigate complaints of disproportionate discipline of students with disability There is near universal consensus that disparities should be grounds for an investigation. In fact, nominee Kenneth Marcus said as much in his recent Senate confirmation process. Federal investigations have explored several areas of concern related to the disproportionate discipline of students with disabilities, including the use of exclusionary discipline to unnecessarily segregate students, the use of disciplinary practices that are harmful and unsafe for students, and the unnecessary treatment of students of color with disabilities differently on the basis of race. The resolutions and consent decrees that emerge have provided roadmaps for schools, a context-specific and functional how-to guide for all schools to engage in positive discipline.
Thank you, Ms.
practices.
Bhargava. We're going to have to stop there. Thanks. Ms. Hill?
Thank you for having me today and in such fabulous company and for taking on this really, really important issue. I'm a partner in the law firm of Brown, Goldstein, and Levy and was a former Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, where I worked on disability rights, education rights, and Title VI enforcement and implementation across the government. I've been a disability rights, civil rights lawyer for 24 years, 25, I guess, in virtually every area: private practice, academia, nonprofit, and local and federal government. And I think we need to all agree that the long-term consequences of discriminatory use, of exclusionary and criminal discipline is shockingly negative, not just for educational outcomes, but for employment, for health, for earnings, and for housing. We can't afford to ignore this problem. The former administration, including the Justice Department where Anarima and I worked, took a systemic approach to racial and disability discrimination in school discipline. We issued guidance, we issued regulations, best practices, and worked collaboratively across the government and with outside entities. We hosted convenings and participated in public meetings to get the information, to review the data, and to make sure that our proposed solutions were useful and workable within the systems that we were working with. We collected data and looked at it and followed up on it. And we engaged in systemic enforcement and systemic solutions as well as individual enforcement. At times we would investigate beyond the individual incident to see if the incident was a part of a pattern or practice or a policy, or whether school discipline policies and practices were having a disparate discriminatory impact on students of color and students with disabilities. And we adopted systemic remedies for such problems for schools, such as consulting with experts, identifying the root causes of disparities, identifying discipline policies, and training staff to ensure that they could respond effectively to behavior issues, and adopting research-based supports and interventions such as PBIS to respond to those and to help students meet the expectations that our schools set for them, as well as adopting, shockingly, MOUs so that school resource officers and law enforcement would know what the limits of their authority were in school, and so everyone would have an understanding of the use that they should be used for in school. I think it's important to point out that the DOJ did not require schools to adopt discipline quotas or to get rid of any particular type of discipline. Rather, the systemic remedies of root cause analysis, data analysis, training, and policies and procedures were designed to change the discrimination that underlies the disparity. In addition, the systemic remedies of PBIS and other interventions for students were designed to avoid the educational harm of unnecessary exclusion from school and ensure that our students could meet our expectations. By contrast, an incident-by-incident approach to investigation and enforcement will end up hiding racial discrimination. Intentional discrimination is often not explicit in a given incident. Non-intentional discrimination, such as the implicit biases that some people have and have not been trained how to address, is often almost invisible in an individual incident. Parents have little or no ability to see that their individual child is being treated differently than another child of another race or without a disability. And because exclusionary discipline is recorded, but the similar incidents that were not subjected to exclusionary discipline are not recorded. In the big picture, we looked beyond the individual incident for the systemic impact and addressed the systemic impact through systemic remedies. And this is an important approach. because although the federal laws recognize disparate impact as a form of discrimination and a way of proving discrimination, only the federal government can take that enforcement approach. Individuals can only deal with the individual, often only explicit discrimination. The current federal response appears to be changing. The Department of Education has already announced that it will not look beyond the individual incident to look for the systemic practices and policies. As a result of that, each parent of each child subjected to discriminatory discipline will have to challenge it themselves. Rather, racial justice and disability advocates will have to work together more than ever to use all the tools available to change this discrimination. And ironically, this may result in more litigation because systemic solutions will not be on the table to stop future incidents. In addition, the Department of Education has stated that it's reviewing its guidance to determine what to rescind. And much of the material on this subject and others on the Department of Education website has begun to be archived. As a national economic issue, this is essential. Federal budget cutting measures are already cutting the safety net that people who can't graduate from high school and can't get jobs would rely on. And incarceration, as a result of school-based exclusionary discipline, cuts holes in that safety net. Excluding students of color and students with disabilities from education and stigmatizing them further with justice system involvement will make it incredibly difficult to get jobs on which they can survive and will put their health at risk for their entire lives. Keeping them in education, even in special education, is cheap by comparison. As national competitiveness issue, it's even more important. We are wasting the talents and skills of tens of thousands of children every year. How can we possibly afford to do that? And as a moral issue, it is similarly essential. The U.S. prides itself on being the land of opportunity where people can use the inherent skills and the skills and talents that they learn to benefit themselves and their communities. We cannot afford to waste them. We do so at our entire country's peril. In a system that's clearly applying discipline more to students of color and students with disabilities, plain justice requires us to respond both to the discriminatory application of discipline and to the stunningly negative effects of the exclusionary forms of discipline to our children and our communities. Schools have to avoid writing off children with disabilities and children of color as being born bad, and have to teach them and support them to meet the expectations that we have. We have to eliminate the discrimination underlying that disproportion, reduce the unnecessary use of discipline, and for as long as those discriminatory attitudes exist, reduce the use of exclusionary discipline.
Thank you, Ms. Hill. Ms. Harper?
Good morning, Commissioners, and thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Kristen Harper, and I'm Senior Policy Specialist for Child Trends, a national nonpartisan research institute devoted to improving the lives of children, youth, and families. Previously, I served as an advisor in the U.S. Department of Education, including in the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services. It is an honor to share with this body Child Trends' perspective on how to safeguard children of color with disabilities from the school to prison pipeline. And I'll start by drawing the Commission's attention to 3 facts. First, children of color with disabilities face high and disparate rates of suspension and expulsion. Both the federal civil rights data collection and data submitted by states under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act confirm this. Second, suspension and expulsion are associated with poor academic and life outcomes. We know from a longitudinal study of over 1 million Texas school children that students who receive a suspension or expulsion are more likely to drop out, be retained in the same grade, or enter the juvenile justice system than their peers. However, this discussion must include a third point: the glaring disparities by race and ethnicity in the identification of education disabilities. Once Black children begin grade school, they are 40% more likely to be identified with a disability than their peers, and twice as likely to be identified with emotional disturbance. In highlighting disparities in disability identification, I'm asserting that the school-to-prison pipeline for children of color with disabilities spans both our general and special education systems. One of the most common reasons for special education referrals is child behavior, and we know teacher perceptions of behavior can vary by student race and ethnicity. A recent Yale study found, for example, that early childhood educators watch Black children more closely than others when prompted to examine a group of children for behavioral challenges. The disparities we see in disability identification then serve as a bellwether for the disparities that we see in discipline. While many federal provisions offer levers to safeguard children of color with disabilities from the school to prison pipeline, I will restrict my remarks to a particular provision under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. Under this provision, Section 618D, states are required to cite districts with significant disproportionality, large racial and ethnic disparities in the identification, placement, or discipline of children with disabilities. Cited districts are required to undergo a review of their policies, practices, and procedures, and set aside 15% of their federal IDEA Part B formula dollars to implement services to address the disparity. In our work to safeguard children of color with disabilities, the importance of Section 618D cannot be overstated. This provision puts resources on the table to drive reforms in the communities that need it most, and it is unique in that it allows us to address the intersections of race and disability, discipline, and disability identification. Historically, the utility of Section 618D has been extremely limited. For many years, states were allowed broad authority to define significant disproportionality and to utilize criteria that kept district citations to a minimum. However, in 2016, the U.S. Department of Education issued new regulations, the Equity in IDEA Rule, to require all states to utilize a standard approach to identify significant disproportionality among school districts. While the regulations still afford states some flexibility to determine when to cite districts, it fosters public transparency by helping communities to compare state definitions of significant disproportionality. Disconcertingly, news outlets have reported in recent weeks that the U.S. Department of Education may delay implementation of the IDEA Equity and IDEA Rule by 2 years, and during that time consider rescinding the rule entirely. These reports seem to be more than rumor, as reporters have identified a draft Federal Register notice that would invite public feedback on a delay of the rule. It must be understood that the Equity and IDEA Rule already offers states plenty of time to get this right. They do not have to use the standard approach until the spring of 2019. Ultimately, this means that children of color already experiencing massive inequities already have to wait 2 years for relief. They should not be made to wait longer. I'll close with a note of caution and highlight 2 emerging threats to our efforts to better support children of color with disabilities. The first threat is a narrative that offers poverty as an explanation for racial and ethnic disparities in disability identification and in discipline. While the analysts advancing this narrative are small in number, they are increasing in volume. I strongly caution the Commission against relying on such research. In making this argument, I could choose to pit research methods against research methods. However, this is not a problem of numbers, but rather a fault within the underlying theories driving research questions and analyses. In a recent piece that I co-authored with Dr. Edward Fergus of Temple University, we reminded policymakers of the dangers of drawing conclusions about a child's characteristics based on their income, or assigning traits to children based off the circumstances of their birth. It evades our collective responsibility to ensure that education systems serving children of different races, ethnicities, and socioeconomic backgrounds treat students fairly and equitably and work to create a more equal playing field for those arriving with different resources and privileges. A second threat is a narrative that frames school discipline reform as a threat to school safety. At a time when communities need our assistance to identify and implement evidence-based practices that prevent conflicts before they start, the best approach to improving school safety, we have no time for narratives that present the goals of school safety and education equity as a zero-sum game. It should go without saying that our educators, our parents, and our students want and need both. And as we examine the distance between our current system and our ideal, we cannot ignore that the chasm is widest wherever schools serve children of color and children with disabilities. When educators are more likely to recommend a suspension for a Black child than a white one for the exact same behavior, as was found in a 2015 study by Stanford University, we cannot endorse claims that initiatives to rectify such disparity are injurious to school safety. I am, again, grateful for the opportunity to share my perspective on these issues and thankful for the Commission's efforts to elevate this important topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Harper. Ms. Coakley?
Thank you. I would like to thank the Commission on Civil Rights for having me here to speak today. It's always a pleasure to engage with long-term friends, even when the topic is one that can't be any nearer to my heart right now than my stomach, because I am quite literally pregnant with my third child at the moment, who is going to be an African-American child with a disability. I would be remiss to not note that Black and Brown disabled leaders, Black and Brown disabled educators have been talking about this issue for decades. People like Talila Lewis, Chris Bell, Dr. Subini Amana, Catherine Perez, and others have repeatedly talked about the disproportionality of discipline practices against students with disabilities. And it's on their research and their support that I'm proud to be here today. As noted, I served in the Obama administration in the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, at the Administration for Community Living at HHS, and finally as the Executive Director of the National Council on Disability, where we had issued a report on this very topic. I walked into my classroom. Let's go back to the 1990s. Yes, the fashion was epic. Yes, the music was terrible. I walked into my classroom in 1993, freshman in high school. My mom was the ADA coordinator for the California Community College District, also a little person. My father ran a Center for Independent Living, also a little person and an individual who used a wheelchair. The first day of high school, I got sent to the guidance counselor. And the first thing he said to me was, "I'm sorry, ma'am, you must be in the wrong place. Kids like you don't go here." My reaction was, wait, there's a school somewhere in the school district for 4'2", redheaded, freckled little people? How did I get to this point in my life without knowing that? He was adamant that disabled students were a problem. Regardless of their race, regardless of their gender, disabled students were a problem. He persisted in being my problem those entire 4 years. And he is why I do the work today. So thank you, Mr. William Connell, wherever you are today. These issues are not just issues to me, but they are my life as a woman with a disability and the mother of 2, almost 3 African-American disabled children. The reality of the world I send them out to daily is all too real. After taking this summer off, I ended up joining the Center for American Progress as a senior fellow to build out the first ever disability policy shop at a non-disability think tank. And it's in that capacity that I'm thrilled to be here, and I think it's important to note that, because disability rights is not just to be segregated to the disability cabbage patch, but it's to be integrated into all civil rights work and into all work in general. How many of you have watched the Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech? Probably more times than anybody here. I'm sure a bunch of y'all have, right? How many of you can tell me who's standing next to Dr. King? I will show you who's standing next to Dr. King. It is a little person, Penny Brown. Penny Brown was a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the NAACP. He was the first African-American member of Little People of America. We don't see Kenny in any of the footage of the speech because he is very clearly obscured by a podium that is taller than his head. Back in the 1950s and 60s, he was actually talking about disproportionality of students of color with disabilities and discipline issues in the education system. And for his time, found himself in a no man's land when the issues of race and the issues of disability were so historically disconnected. Flash forward to 2 years ago, July 27th, 2016, in celebration of the Americans with Disabilities Act, David Johns and I convened a meeting focusing on what it means to be young, gifted, Black, and disabled. It was the first discussion ever of its kind, and it was the first time that the National Council on Disability had teamed up with the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence of African Americans. We centered the agenda around the largest group in the room, which were 7 to 17-year-old African American disabled kids. And we did what you should never do in a room full of children. We gave them the microphone. And there was a 9-year-old boy in the room, and we asked him, what does it mean to be young, gifted, Black, and disabled? And he said, it means that I have to think about how I control my autism every time I leave the house so that I'm not beaten up at school or the cops don't shoot me. He was 9 years old. The fact that that is the #1 concern of a 9-year-old boy today tells us how dire this situation is, how much we need to continue doing the work on this. We need to stop approaching this issue as if there's only one domain that needs to be fixed, and instead look at it as a series of systems and services facing young people of color transitioning to adulthood We need to reset expectations for our young people and frankly for the adults whose job it is to be, well, the adults in the room. Kids of color with disabilities start off with the same fundamental needs of all young people, but it's the adults that tend to screw things up, I find. We need to look at the intersection of racism and ableism and see how these two oppressions dance in such a way that create, perpetuate, and reinforce each other. So many young people with disabilities are not diagnosed until they enter the carceral system. I refuse to call it a justice system, so I will leave it at that. But the very fact that students of color are predominantly undiagnosed when they enter makes disability part of a punishment instead of part of a community. So while you're not just here because you're bad, you're here because you're bad and you're broken. And while talking about the school to prison pipeline, I would be remiss not to address the sexual abuse to prison pipeline for Black and brown girls, which I haven't heard anybody talk about yet, which is critically important, and specifically point out the adultification of young Black women, particularly young Black disabled women. We've seen it with the Me Too campaign. Society was quick to erase its roots in the Black community by activist Tarana Burke. Research from Georgetown tells us that educators believe that Black girls are more independent, need less comfort, need less support than their white peers. Because of this, we need comprehensive bias training across schools, across youth-serving professionals, starting from the daycare all the way up to adult education classes. As a mother of 2 children, I already see in my daughter how she's held to a different standard than her brother. She is 4 years old and already telling her father and I that she needs a boyfriend. We stress to her daily that no one has the rights to put their hands on her, and she has the right to say no to anybody who even tries. Part of what we fundamentally need to do, and in closing, is stop talking about IDEA and Section 504 as indicators that there's something wrong with children, and instead talk about them as mechanisms for exercising one's civil rights. I look forward to any additional questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Coakley. Mr. Scanlon? Ms. Coakley, if you can just write, thank you.
Thank you. I'm here to talk about things one needs to know about data to deal with these issues. And these are things I learned while litigating a very large case for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So I'd like to go to my next slide. The federal civil rights policies regarding school discipline has been based on the premise that generally reducing adverse discipline outcomes will tend to reduce relative racial differences in discipline rates, and the proportion racial minorities make up of students who are disciplined. In fact, exactly the opposite is the case. Next slide. Just for clarification, if suspension rates are 15% for minorities and 5% for whites, the ratio of the minority rate to the white rate is 3.0. That is, the minority rate is 3 times the white rate. The relative difference is 200%. The minority rate is 200% greater than the white rate. If minorities make up 20% of students, they would make up 43% of suspended students. Next slide. This shows implications on relative differences in pass rates of lowering a test cutoff, where two groups differ in their average test scores. At the higher cutoff, the pass rate is 80% for the AG, the advantaged group, and 63% for DG, the disadvantaged group. Thus, AG's pass rate is 1.27 times or 27% greater than DG's pass rate. If we lower the cutoff to the point where 95% of AG passes the test, about 87% of DG would pass the test. Thus, AG's pass rate is now only 1.09 times DG's pass rate, 9% greater. Thus, by lowering the cutoff, we reduce the relative difference in pass rates. And it is because lowering the cutoff reduces the relative difference in pass rates that lowering a cutoff is universally regarded as reducing the disparate impact of a test on which some groups outperform others. It's also a reason that we generally think that stringent policies are harder on disadvantaged groups than more lenient ones. Next slide. But whereas lowering a test cutoff tends to reduce relative difference in pass rates, it tends to increase relative differences in failure rates, as shown in the last column. Initially, the ratio of DG's failure rate to AG's failure rate was 1.85. Lowering the cutoff increases that ratio to 2.60. Thus, persons who examine a disparate impact issue focusing on the relative difference in pass rates would say lowering the cutoff reduced the disparate impact. Those who examine relative differences in failure rates would say lowering the cutoff increased the disparate impact. And next slide. This slide that comports with table 3 of my written statement, and for instant purposes, I'll simply say that it shows also in the final column that lowering the cutoff increased the proportion DG made up of persons who failed the test. And I'll add here that an important thing that this particular table shows is that when you reduce the adverse outcome rate, when you reduce the proportion of a group that experiences an outcome, you tend to increase the proportion that group makes up of persons who experience the outcome. In the case of restraint disparities, for example, it is the states that use restraints as the very last resort. They will have higher proportion of its restrained students being students with disabilities than states that more regularly use restraints. Now, previous slide, please. Now, the pattern I show here is, I use this slide because it's just simpler to look at, but the pattern shown here is not peculiar to test score data. It's found in essentially any situation where two groups differ in their susceptibility to some outcome. Credit data and income data show that lowering an income or credit score requirement while tending to reduce relative differences in meeting the requirements tends to increase relative differences in failing to meet the requirements. And in fact, all across the country, we're observing that schools that have been relaxing standards while believing doing so will tend to reduce relative differences in discipline rates are observing those relative differences increasing. And the schools that are faced with an impossible situation as they do things that they think will have one outcome and in fact have an opposite outcome. Now, I cite a letter to the Department of Education and the Departments of HHS and Justice in my written statement urging them to explain that their prior guidance on this particular issue was mistaken. I think they have a moral obligation to do that, but I'm not sure whether they're going to be able to understand this issue. Thus, I urge the Commission not only to take on the responsibility of understanding this issue, but take on the responsibility of a larger issue of regarding the fact that all analyses of demographic differences suffer fatally from the failure to understand the way the measures employed tend to be affected by the prevalence of an outcome. In my written statement, I reference my comments for the Commission on Evidence-Based Medicine, the comments for the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking. I think those comments would provide a useful guide to the Commission for it to undertake a study of these issues that, if addressed sensibly, will put the analysis of demographic differences on a better footing than it's ever been. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scanlon, and to the full panel. I should also just say for the record that Commissioner Degbelet has joined us and has been with us since before this panel began. I'll open up for questions and comments from my fellow commissioners. Mr. Krishna.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to the panelists. It's been very illuminating. Thanks to staff for putting together a great panel. Got a lot of questions, but I'll limit myself to a couple. I think it was Ms. Hill, you indicated, I believe, that, and my reading of the guidance says there is no requirements to adopt quotas. But isn't it in fact the result that that's what school districts will try to do in order to achieve some semblance of proportionality? In fact, there are reports that school districts are adopting rigid quota systems with respect to discipline. Minneapolis Public Schools, in announcing their new discipline policy, said, Minneapolis public schools must aggressively reduce the disproportionality between black and brown students and their white peers every year for the next 4 years. This will begin with a 25% reduction in disproportionality by the end of this school year, 50% by 2016, 75% by 2017, and 100% by 2018. How does the Department of Education follow up on this to ensure that there isn't any adoption of unlawful quota systems in the imposition of discipline?
Well, I don't know what the Department of Education.
Ms. Hill, I think your mic is not on.
Or the Department of Justice, I'm sorry.
I think your mic is still not on, sorry.
There we go.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. The Department of Justice would not have required quotas in that way. I think probably what the Minneapolis School District, and I can't speak for them either, is trying to do is set goals to force people to engage in the activities that will reduce the discriminatory impact. So there are two issues that have to be addressed here. One you can address by quotas, which is we're going to reduce the harms that students face based on exclusionary discipline. And you can address that by eliminating exclusionary discipline. But if you're going to address the disproportionate effect of exclusionary discipline, you have to address the underlying causes, which include intentional and non-intentional discrimination, implicit racial and disability bias, and the lack of supports and interventions surrounding those students. As a goal, a number is fine. Simply cutting off the exclusion of students of any color or of students of all color is not the full answer to the disproportionality question. So the Department of Justice wouldn't have said cut off exclusionary discipline. They would have said provide the services and supports that surround students to allow them to meet the expectations for behavior that we have for them, and provide teachers supports and training and policies that help them determine when exclusionary discipline should be applied consistently across the board and not influenced by racial bias.
I understand, I appreciate that. I guess the answer is the DOJ doesn't do anything to police the imposition or the utilization of quotas, though. It seems that a number of school districts are doing just that. I have a question, I think, for Mr. Scanlon.
Should we give Ms. Hill a chance to respond?
Sure.
It's not that we wouldn't police them, we wouldn't require them.
I understand that, because that would be unlawful, yet they're adopting unlawful quotas. We had a hearing a couple of years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago actually, on bullying and the prevalence of bullying. And we've been focused here on the exclusion or discipline imposed on, and justifiably so, on students of color, an intersection of students of color, students of disabilities. But there's a second cohort here. That is, if students are expelled or suspended, and that is lessened, that means that certain students will remain in class. And have there been any studies on the effect, the disparate effect on students of color and or students with disabilities on keeping those disruptive individuals in class? And I'd like to illuminate it with a couple of stats from the Department of Education and from the CDC. In 2014, there were 50.7 million students K through 12. Nearly 4 million, 3,954,000 were involved in a physical fight in the preceding 12 months. 2,200,000 carried guns, knives, or clubs in the last 30 days. 486,000 were involved in non-fatal violent victimizations. 160,000 students were teachers were physically attacked. 3,100,000 reported being threatened or injured with weapons. 11,400,000 were bullied in the last year. And 2,839,000 didn't go to school in the last 30 days because they were afraid of students in their class and being assaulted by students in their class. And it seems to me the most vulnerable cohort would be students with disabilities, as we found in our bullying briefing. If disparities are reduced, and probably justifiably so, in those who are expelled and they remain in the classroom, have there been studies shown as to the effect on others of those remaining in the classroom and what disparate effects that may have on people of color and people with disabilities? To anyone.
Commissioner, I deeply appreciate your question. While the studies I'm aware of examine the implementation of evidence-based practices that allow schools to both reduce, the use of discipline while not suffering any increases in student misbehavior. However, I would also very much caution, all of the commission members against labeling a child disruptive versus not disruptive on any given day. A child could walk into a classroom on a Monday after having suffered some form of trauma out of, in their home or out in their community. A friend, may have passed away, a close member of the family may have moved away. Any number of things could happen, which means that on any given day coming into school, a child may have a behavioral incident that is due to trauma or due to, the circumstances that life may throw at him. What we're asking here is that schools do not simply throw away, exclude children that come to school with those difficulties, but are prepared to handle children that are coming to school with the highs and lows of emotion, the trials and tribulations of, approaching adolescence. And I think we do ourselves a disservice and really sort of steer the conversation in the wrong direction when we try to say, okay, well, what is the impact of the disruptive students on the non-disruptive students? Instead, our conversation really should focus on how we support educators and support schools in utilizing evidence-based practices that help schools to identify quickly when a child is having an emotional breakdown or having an emotional issue and seek to address it. I'll quickly refer to a story often told by Judge Stephen Teskey of a child that came into school one day and threw a chair across the back of a classroom. Did not injure anybody, but did, take a rather extreme action in a classroom. And once upon a time, that child would have been arrested and shipped off to a juvenile detention center faster than you could blink. Instead, that child was sat down, by principals, by people that could support her, and they talked to her, and they learned that she had been sexually assaulted for weeks on end by her mother's boyfriend. And so at the end of the day, that child received services and did not harm any other individual. And the person that had been assaulting her all that time was the person that was addressed.
If I may, I'd like to build on Ms. Harper's comments, which I entirely agree with. I think there's a couple of things to tease out in your questions, Commissioner Kirsten. First of all, I think the idea that that schools are safer when there are students who are suspended or expelled or not in the classroom, the stats that you presented are certainly concerning about the kinds of violence that's going on in our schools. And the idea here is not to not have the option of using things like suspensions or expulsions or other kinds of disciplinary practices to address what is violent behavior in a classroom that threatens the safety of students and employees. But what we're seeing in large part in what's happening in schools around the country is that these practices are being used for very minor disciplinary issues. And so for the most part, and that the exclusion of students from schools is not allowing them the opportunity to learn how to behave in classrooms. It's to be able to behave and engage academically is something that students need to learn, and they need to learn it together. And if you kick them out of class, they don't have a chance to be able to do that. And secondly, when we think about what makes schools more safe, it is that opportunity to give tools and resources to teachers and to administrators to figure out how it is that they can most effectively manage their classrooms. And what we know is that excessive exclusionary discipline does not work. What does work are practices that can allow teachers and administrators to understand the reasons why students may be acting out in school, allow them to engage with students to help them to learn how it is that they should be engaging in school and in classrooms, and give them the opportunity to not only reinforce those behaviors, but have them be ones that build a stronger community among students. And so for all of those reasons, the point here is not that we don't have a range of options to be able to address the kind of violence and the kind of concerns that are going on in schools, but it's that those options that keep kids outside of classrooms and don't allow them to learn are reduced. And secondly, what we do know, there is research that tells us that when students are disciplined and you're in a punitive context where there's an excessive use of discipline, it not only harms the students who are being disciplined, it also harms the students who are not being disciplined. The reason for that is that that kind of classroom environment is not one in which students are learning how to engage with one another, and they feel the degree of anxiety, the degree of concern about that kind of control is it breaks down cohesion in classrooms. And so I'll give you one study which has looked at this issue from in the state of Kentucky. That is from Brea Perry and Edward Morris. And what they found is that the adverse effect of exclusionary discipline is strongest in schools with high levels of discipline and low levels of violence, but it's evident in even the most violent and disorganized school environments. And that adverse impact is that the academic achievement of students that are disciplined and are not disciplined is reduced when you have these kinds of punitive contexts. And that's something I think we should all be concerned about.
Thank you. Although I would note, it's just puzzling to me. We keep using this term, and I'd like to know what the baseline is. We keep using this term, excessive exclusionary discipline, but based on Department of Education, the CDC, in 2014, I just recited stats that when you add them all up, come up to 17 million individuals who were either in some type of fight, some kind of altercation, some type of non-fatal violent victimization, teachers physically attacked, but the total number of those expelled was 130,000. 17 million where somebody's getting punched out. You had 130,000 expulsions. Now, I grew up in the Mesozoic era, and if you hit a teacher, you're gone. You had 160,000 teachers were hit, and 130,000 total expulsions, and not each one of those was due to a teacher being hit. So what's the definition of excessive? Especially when you have nearly 3 million students who took at least one day off in the preceding 30 days because they're afraid to come to school.
I could respond a little bit of that. I'd also ask, what's the definition of being hit? Because in my special education practice years ago, the definition of being hit, which was used to expel a student with a disability, was that he poked the teacher in the hand with a green felt tip pen. So there are varying degrees of
Sure, and the
fitness.
CDC says 3,954,000 were involved in a physical fight. I assume that's not being touched with an eraser. Some cohort of that 3,954,000 was probably, look, I kind of resemble this remark. I was kind of a miscreant as a kid, but some of those were probably physical fights. And there were 486,000, strike that, 160,000 teachers physically attacked. I doubt it was with an eraser. At least some cohort was probably something more than an eraser. Yet, we only have 130,000 expulsions. So I'd like to know, what does excessive mean? What is the correct number that should be expelled?
Sir, may I can't answer that question, but on this, the effect on the student environment of stringent discipline policies, I have a webpage discussing the APA, American Psychological Association Zero Tolerance Study, and I regard that as representative of a dubious body of research that always finds that stringent discipline policies lead to degrade the educational environment rather than improve it. I don't know any sound, I'm not in a position to appraise all that research, but I think that's something that the commission could very seriously study to see really what are the effects. I don't really believe in the research that's out there, but the commission can study it and try and really find out what are the effects of varying levels of discipline on the educational environment and on educational achievement.
So I have some familiarity with the CDC's numbers as well as the numbers gathered by the National Center for Education Statistics. However, I don't have the precise numbers that you have in front of me. But one concern is I'm not sure that those numbers can be added together. You may have instances in those numbers where you have a single child engaging in multiple acts. And then looking at a child involved with that could easily include an incident where one child was an aggressor, one child was a victim, if even that incident even permits that sort of division between the students involved. So I would not suggest in trying to figuring up an appropriate or adequate level of discipline, doing a comparison between statistics out there on the prevalence of violent or disruptive behavior to a comparison of how many students are being removed from school. I will say this though. The vast majority of out-of-school suspensions the vast majority of out-of-school suspensions and school suspensions, they are not for violent behaviors. They're for disruptive behaviors. We're finding that much of the disparities that we see are for incidents of what's often termed willful defiance or insubordination. My fellow panelists also referenced some areas of discipline where I think we would all agree that, discipline in those cases, particularly in out-of-school suspension, seems, egregious. A child coming to school wearing the wrong sock. A child in one case in one school, we had a couple of students that were suspended for, wearing their hair in braids. And I will say, much of the work that is needed to address, the excessive use of discipline is trying to look at those non-violent, non-criminal behaviors where we can absolutely be thinking about alternate ways of reaching kids and teaching kids about, how do you, sit and engage and, stay on task and, treat others with kindness and respect.
Let me also just add to that. This is not a numbers game. This is a game about how it is that we actually provide a more effective way in which to manage misbehavior in schools and to make sure that everybody in a school building is safe. And so it's specific to what it is that excessive refers to. When we're talking about excessive exclusionary discipline or punitive practices, it's not a numbers game as much as it is excessive is when there are students who are being suspended and expelled for minor disciplinary infractions, like the ones that Ms. Harper just mentioned. Excessive is when you have students who are being expelled or suspended or arrested for the same kind of behaviors that other students are not being arrested or arrested or expelled or suspended for. Excessive is when you have the use of really dangerous practices like restraint and seclusion on students when those are not necessary and actually make students very much unsafe in schools. Excessive is when you have situations in which you may have a student who is manifesting a disability and is punished for the manifestation of the disability without identifying what that disability, why that disability may be there, and making sure that the students get services and are not actually punished for what it is that might be a manifestation of the disability. Excessive is when you have students of color who are deemed to be emotionally disturbed and segregated out of classrooms at rates that are far beyond students not of color, and they're placed in environments, in classrooms and schools where they don't get the kind of educational resources, and they're secluded from students who may be engaging in the same kind of behaviors but are not found to have an emotional disturbance. So those are the ways in which we see school discipline being excessive in schools. And so those are the kinds of things that we're worried about. The question of what these numbers tell us, there are all kinds of things that are related to the kinds of misbehaviors we have in school. But what we know is that the vast majority of students who are being excluded, who are being punished, are being excluded and punished for things that teachers across the board, so the American Federation for Teachers, the National Education Association, have themselves said, we don't want to engage in this kind of discipline for those kinds of practices. It's not making us more safe. It's not making our kids more safe. And they are among the many national education organizations that have really welcomed the kinds of tools and resources that were put out by the federal government to make sure that we promote positive school climates and reduce the use of things that really aren't making students any safer and are not educationally sound.
Thanks, Ms. Braga. I see, Ms. Hill, you've had wanted to get in. I'm going to give you just 1 minute. I have questions from other commissioners.
It'll take only 1 minute. I would say, just in response to the numbers, if we agree that discipline is actually not being used enough, and yet we can see that discipline is being used more on students of color and students with disabilities, that would indicate that discipline is not being used enough for white students without disabilities. And I would say that's part of the disproportion problem. The disproportion problem may not be that we are not using discipline enough. I doubt that, but it may be that we're just using it more on certain students. And I would say the students with disabilities who are staying away from school because they're being bullied are not being kept away from school because of bullying by students with disabilities. So why are students with disabilities being excluded and suspended at greater rates than the students who are apparently bullied?
Thank you, Ms. Hill. Commissioner Degley?
Good morning. Thanks for your thoughtful testimony to each of the panelists. I want first to direct a question to Ms. Bargava and Ms. Hill that will help me understand some of the skepticism that some of my colleagues have expressed about the federal role in this area. And it's my understanding that there are certain federal laws passed by the Congress of the United States that require the federal government to enforce them where there are factual bases to do so. You've mentioned some of those laws today. And so I've taken a look at the Dear Colleague letter that was referenced from 2014. And it says that successful programs may incorporate a wide range of strategies to reduce misbehavior and maintain a safe learning environment, including, and then it mentions a lot of the interventions that each of you have described. And then it goes on to say that the department recognizes that schools may use disciplinary measures program to promote safe and orderly educational environments. So if that is the guidance that DOJ was offering, it seems to me that you're recognizing, first, that there's a range of ways to address these problems, and second, that there is an important federal role and a need for guidance in this area. And so if you could speak specifically to what the feelings of trust would be for families of students that are either having discrimination targeted at them because of their race or disability or an intersection of those two, what trust would families have if the federal government abdicates its responsibility in this area?
So thank you, Commissioner Degley. You are correct that the guidance that was issued in January 2014 was really to put out information on the administration of fair and effective discipline. And the goal was not to take away from schools and teachers the kinds of tools and resources they may have to address misbehavior in classrooms, was really to give a range of ways in which they could provide a positive school climate for all children in accordance with federal law. And so back to my response to Commissioner Kirstenau, that does not mean that there are the use of suspensions and expulsions and even arrests in schools is something that is banned entirely. There are instances in which those kinds of practices may well be necessary, and particularly in the case where there's an imminent threat to the safety and security of students and school employees. The goal really was to make sure that when discipline is imposed in school, it's not done in a discriminatory manner. And what we're talking about today is the ways in which multiple investigations, the information that we're getting in terms of data shows that students of color and students with disabilities are being disproportionately disciplined in myriad ways in schools, not only in terms of the proportion of students of color and students with disabilities who end up with pretty severe disciplinary consequences, but also in the kinds of circumstances in which we see students of color and students with disability getting in trouble, where there are lots of other ways in which we could actually handle those kinds of situations. So I think it's important, in fact, it's necessary that for parents and for students, they know that when their kids are going to school, they will be the kinds of misbehavior, the kinds of classroom management practices that will be used to address that misbehavior, that's done in a fair and consistent manner, and in a manner that really is ensuring that what students come to class for, which is to learn, and to learn how it is that they actually are able to engage with one another, that is the goal. The goal is not to have a situation in which the relationship between parents and students in schools is one in which students are out of class, they're out of school, and they're not finding ways in which we actually reinforce the kinds of behaviors that were talked about in the guidance, that were talked about in the larger school discipline package. And again, I think it's important to understand that the reaction, what was a catalyst for the school discipline package? The catalyst was the voices of students and parents and community members and teachers and principals and national education organizations who really asked for information, asked for guidance, and asked for tools and resources. And the result, both of the investigations and of the guidance, is that you see in classrooms around the country changes, that teachers and students have talked about the ways in which that's positively impacted what they feel like and their excitement about going to school, and in fact has built the kind of community and trust that focuses on dignity and on respect for students and for teachers in that process. And so what we see from what got us here and what's happened afterwards in terms of the engagement by the federal government on school discipline is that it has been a almost uniformly positive one in terms of there's a range of resources out there for students and teachers to be able to use, and for parents to actually be able to restore the trust that they had lost in schools where 6 out of 10 students are being suspended or expelled. That's just not something that we need in terms of how we actually interact in schools today.
Thank you. I have a list now going of questions. And Commissioner Yaki, I just want to make sure that if you have a question, you have time. So I'm going to come to you after the next question. Vice Chair.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair. This question is for Ms. Hill. For a period in my judicial career, I served as a juvenile court judge. And so your written statement where you included words to the effect, and I'm quoting now, the police officers who used to bar the front door are now resource officers out the back door. I was wondering if you would elaborate on that, and in doing so, tell us exactly how you see the role of school resource officers in schools today, and if you could touch upon whether these resource officers are aggravating or alleviating the zero tolerance policies that often push children out.
Thank you for the question. I think what I was referring to is that, perhaps not coincidentally, the same students who were previously explicitly banned from public education are now, we're seeing the students who are more disproportionately taken out of the public education system in the discipline process. And it's interesting to me that one of the ways that some schools are doing this is by implementing law enforcement in the schools and calling them school resource officers, which don't have to be, I want to be clear, don't have to be a negative. They don't have to be a way of getting students out of school. They can be a way of, if they're trained properly, if their mission is clear to both sides, they can do a law enforcement role. But they are a law enforcement role. And what we've seen happen too often is they don't have a clear understanding of the limits of their role, and the administrators and teachers don't have a clear understanding of their role. And so administrators and teachers will take conduct that used to be a reason for a trip to the principal's office or a note home to your parents, and turn it over to the school resource officer. Because that person is there, that person has a higher level of authority than it appears the teacher may have, and the teacher has other things to do and may not have had the training to effectively deal with the behavior in an educational way, in a positive way, in a way that keeps the student in the class. And so that over-reliance, that unclarity of roles, many schools don't even have memoranda of understanding with their school resources officers or their local law enforcement to make clear what those roles should be. And it's resulting in all the prejudices and fears and misunderstandings, leading to the result that we took a strong stance against of having students of color and students with disabilities not be in these schools.
Commissioner Yaki, do you have a question?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I don't know if I really have a question as much as just comment, and maybe some of the panelists can respond, and this may be the same one I asked for each panel, which is it's almost foundational, which is what are the kind of it sounds so much like there's a question of resources available to these schools in terms of training, in terms of education, in terms of awareness of how to deal with young children. And it comes at a time when you see right now that Congress is passing laws to that would effectively divert even more resources away from our public schools. And I'm just wondering, have there been any studies on the impact of reductions in public education funding and impact on these kinds of programs that would sort of help break the cycle or increase the sensitivity training or the kind of personnel resources that would be needed to deal with this issue?
And I will say that there are 4 commissioners with questions pending and 8 minutes left, so go quickly with your answers.
Commissioner Yaki, I think we'll just say that there have been really extensive federal grants and resources that have been provided to schools, to school resource officers, and to others to really support these kinds of practices that have made our schools much more safe and are educationally sound. And so the ability to have those resources has been incredibly important to schools. It's one of the major ways in which the federal government engaged in this area. And so I think it's important that those resources across the board continue.
I'll just quickly add that there are glimmers of hope in terms of access to resources that can help address this issue. It's important to realize in 2009 was the last year in which states received Title IV ESEA dollars under the Safe and Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act. I mean, it was formula dollars went to every single state to support issues of student health and safety, and it stopped abruptly in 2009. In 2017, for the first time since then, all states received $400 million under the new Student Support and Academic Enrichment Program, which, while it has to be divided up under a few priorities, includes formula dollars to address student health and safety. So that's a critical source of funding that can address the issues that we're talking about today. And I'll note, most schools have some sort of resources to address issues of student safety, student health, but the issue is that they're not deployed efficiently. And our work is really to help them figure out, is this the approach we really should be using? Is it evidence-based? Let's look at your data. Is it really accomplishing what it needs to accomplish? If not, we need to rethink.
Thank you. Commissioner Harriet?
Thank you. Thank you. I think I have basically 2 questions here. There, is that on? Okay, I have 2 questions. One of them is aimed primarily, I think, to you, Ms. Bargava, but maybe to everybody as well. A couple of times in your testimony and answers to questions, you've used the phrase, "what we know." And when you do, I have seen members of the audience nodding this way in vigorous disagreement with what we know here. And I'm wondering if it's time for a little bit more modesty in terms of federal presence in this issue. There's a long history here. A number of you have referred to exclusionary discipline, that is excluding students, suspensions, expulsions, saying they're bad because students don't receive instruction. The thing is, like back before the 1970s, much more common practice was to hold students after school, that is more instruction rather than less instruction. But as a result of federal officials social justice warriors in courts, it became much, much more difficult for schools to have any kind of a serious program where students are kept after school. And it's starting to look like that was a mistake, that maybe that would have been a better practice to hold students after school.
And then ask you to move to the question just because we have very little time.
Yeah, whole different series of social justice warriors created sexual harassment policies that ended up creating incentives for schools to suspend kindergartners, which again turned out to be a bad policy. Congress, we've referred to resource officers here. Yeah, Congress has created subsidies that create incentives for schools to hire police officers or retired police officers or things that are like police officers. And now that's turned out to be something that people object to. Isn't it time we be a bit more modest on this? Another thing that you brought up, my second question.
Let's pause there just for one, because we have three other people who have questions after you. So does anybody want to respond to that question?
I'll say one sentence. When I say what we know, I'm speaking about decades of research and experience. I'm speaking of what it is.
That nodding and disagreement still going on.
I can't see behind me, unfortunately. So I don't know what people are doing behind me, but I can say that we're speaking to research, experience, what schools, what teachers in themselves and education organizations across the country have said is what is more effective and educationally sound to try to make schools safer.
Commissioner Arasaki.
Thank you. Since we have limited time, Ms. Coakley, I would like to ask you to, in writing later, let the commission know from the report that the National Council on Disabilities did, what recommendations you think have been followed up on and which ones you think still need to be. So my main question is, I've struggled with this issue because in the testimony, there's both the over-identification of minority and disability students and the under-identification. So I want to focus on the under-identification and say, why is that happening, and what could we be doing? What could the federal government be doing to help make sure that kids are being identified with disabilities when they have them, so that they could get the supports that they need? So what's happening that it's not happening now, and what could be done?
I deeply appreciate that question. And I actually think it's an area where there's a lot more thought that needs to be brought to bear to figure out how to address this. To be clear, when we look at IDA Section 618D and other areas where we're trying to figure out, okay, do we have overrepresentation versus underrepresentation? I use overrepresentation and underrepresentation deliberately. You cannot use numbers to identify over-identification or under-identification. The only way I know to do that is to actually look at a child, an individual child's records, and look at the process that a school used to decide whether or not this is a child with disabilities or not, and make a case-by-case determination of whether or not the schools and the district's decision-making was appropriate. I do not doubt that under-identification exists, but while we can look at over-representation in the numbers and say, you know what, there's an issue here that's going on, and we need to find ways to understand why we are seeing such wide disparities such that children of color are overrepresented, it's completely impossible to use that same sort of analysis to identify under-identification. Why? Because there is such a thing as a natural zero. There are some places where some places actually won't be identifying any children with disabilities.
Well, actually, I mean, one of the reasons why I have the question is in a couple of testimonies, it's pointed out that students who become end up in a detention or incarcerated in some way are later identified as having a disability. So it seems to me that they should have been identified before they got there. And so there has to be something that's happening there.
And I'll invite our panelists to respond to that in writing, if you could. We are out of time. I know that both Commissioner Cladney and I have questions. Maybe we can ask them and see if you'll be willing to respond to us in writing afterwards. Mr. Cladney.
My question's pretty quick. Mrs. Rahav Gaba? God, I'm terrible. I apologize. Anyways, it was spoken about options and training and things like that. And Commissioner Harriet asked you about, in her last question, about you say this and you say that, and people shake their heads no. And you said there's research. And I was wondering if there's some studies that you not necessarily a study, but citations to studies for us. If you could provide that to us regarding jurisdictions where these options and different trainings have taken place and the result from before and after, I think that would be extremely helpful. And I just have a comment. When I was in school and kids got in a fight, they didn't go to jail. That's all. I don't know about anybody else.
Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to ask my question and just say that Mr. Scanlon, in his testimony and in his written testimony, attributed a set of beliefs to federal discipline policy. And for the three panelists who were participant in generating federal discipline policy, I'd be interested in having you respond about whether you believed that the generation of that policy would tend to reduce relative percentages of racial differences in rates of experiencing discipline. And I don't think we have time for a response now, so I would welcome a written response if you would be willing. Thank you very much to each of our panelists. We appreciate it. We will take a break until 10:40 when we will begin the next panel.
Yes, maybe I missed it. I'm not sure. Just one second, sorry. There are 17 people signed up now, so there's 3 spaces that you have panels. We can just sign you in. Okay. More people may sign up. Do you want to just sign it? Or sign it wherever it is. Just sign, yeah, okay, great. Yeah. Sign it. Okay, great. Yeah, okay, thank you. That was good. Oh. Okay, okay, perfect. You know it's open flag, but is the optimal level of proportionality so that we achieve the appropriate level of this? How is that not a well, the obvious answer is like if you misbehave, you should be punished. I mean, it's just I don't doubt that there's some people, some school district somewhere that's overusing some type of discipline. I don't believe somebody's expelled for a long-term sentence, but it just defies logic to say that there are 3,000 expulsions. And those numbers are significant. I would give you 3,900,000 physical fights, maybe one with somebody throwing a race. But there's a certain subset of those that were pretty bloody, probably. It probably exceeds the 130,000 expulsions. Yeah, I thought. Hi, man. How you doing? Good. I probably have some questions for you. Sorry. I figured out who you had to be. No, it was cute. You want to ask me? Here. I'm going to ask you. You know what I was going to ask them was they said there's disproportionality in disabled persons, and I'm just going to ask you what you wrote in your testimony about how it's the emotional experience, and then because I am then going to make a couple of references. The thing that annoyed me was the woman who said it's not the disabled students who are bullying, it's the emotional experience. And I thought that was disingenuous, so I just want to. So I will bring that up and I'll get it to you. Yeah, I thought, yeah, I would love to talk about it. After I read your testimony, I realized I need to beef up the parts of it because it does have some parts that are really more your jurisdiction than mine. And so you can probably make it better for me. So I'll try to get it worked on this week or next week, maybe this week. And I'm sure that you are going to be able to include the part such as which you're quoted in, by the way, of course. Pardon? it's two. We have two. And when Trump gets another 2 out of 8 out of 8. When Trump gets 2 appointments, it'll be 4-4, but that won't be for 2 years. And like my term expires, so it may be a different 4-4. He's willing to look at our article.
Oh, so. Wonderful. Okay.
There's Teresa looking cute down in her silly vest.
Yes. I'm not sure, by the way, why Scanlon and what's his name, Paul Morgan are flipped in terms of panel order. I think this would happen the last one. I don't think it really matters.
Yeah, maybe somebody had some timing issue.
Yeah, that's what I'm guessing. Scale is on, so the mic is on, so a John 5%.
Okay, we're coming back to order as it is now 10:40. We'll proceed with our second panel. In the order in which they speak, our panelists are Max Eden, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, Dan Lowson, Director of the Center for Civil Rights Remedies at the University of California, Los Angeles, Monique Morris, founder and president of the National Black Women's Justice Institute, and Paul Morgan, professor of education at Pennsylvania State University. Appreciate each of you coming. Mr. Eden, please begin.
The school to prison pipeline. It's a very rhetorically powerful term, and it's a very intuitively plausible notion. There's two key assumptions, that a substantial share of the disparity in discipline rates is caused by teacher bias, and that suspensions cause students harm. This assumption was the basis of the Obama administration's 2014 school discipline guidance, wherein Arne Duncan laid 100% of the blame for the disparity on teachers and their alleged racial discrimination, and he declared that the school to prison pipeline must be fought every day. However, more rigorous research published since has largely undermined both of those assumptions. And evidence is mounting that efforts to fight the school to prison pipeline is creating a school climate catastrophe and has, if anything, put at-risk students at greater risk. Now, back when Duncan made his declarations, there was some plausible evidence. Not for the notion that teacher discrimination caused 100% of the gap. That was an absurd slander against the most compassionate professionals in America. But the notion that it played some part. Best study of the time, published by Russell Skyba in 2011, found that black students were suspended more frequently and more severely than white students for the same offenses. But the study admitted two shortcomings. It didn't control for schools, and it didn't control for past student behavior. In 2014, Skyba rectified these shortcomings, and within school discrimination vanished. This is not a one-off finding. Joshua Kinsler found it in 2011 in North Carolina. Gary Ritter found it in 2017 in Arkansas. The overall disparity is driven primarily by differences between schools, not discrimination within schools. It's notable, though, that all these studies, including one by Tom Lovelace this year, has found a consistent pattern that schools with higher percentages of African-American students have higher suspension rates. This could be perceived as troubling and could be interpreted as systemic discrimination or systemic bias. But schools can't be biased. Only people can be biased, only teachers can be biased, only principals can be biased. And that bias does not play a substantial part in these between-school differences. Constance Lindsay and Cassandra Hart published a very thorough study to assess discrimination in teacher referral to the principal's office. At middle and high schools serving high shares of African-American students, there was no difference in suspension based on teacher race. That's not to say that bias doesn't exist, just that it does not account for a large or even moderate share of the gap. Lindsay and Hart found that, in raw terms, black teachers were more likely to suspend black students. However, applying reasonable assumptions and controls, they then found that white teachers were slightly more likely to. They estimate, though, that if black students were taught by all black teachers, it would reduce their odds of receiving a suspension by about 2%. Now, that's not nothing, but it's not 100%. The evidence that suspensions cause harm has also largely been undermined by more rigorous research. Prior research was content to look at a correlation and call it a causation. It went like this. You have two students who look the same to statisticians. One punches one of those 160,000 teachers, gets suspended, and drops out. The other behaves, doesn't get suspended, and graduates. Advocacy shops then broadcast this finding as evidence that the suspension was the problem. That is not good social science. To assess causality, you'd have to control for behavior. This year, two studies from the University of Arkansas did just that. One found a 4% increase in the chances of being held back in the next grade, which is plausibly negative, though the literature on grade retention is mixed, and it should be noted for the purpose of intersectionality of this panel, students with disabilities became 12% less likely to be held back. The other study found a statistically significant, though practically not large, improvement in the next year on reading and math scores. If we are willing to revise our assumptions based on better evidence, then the fairest statement becomes, teacher bias does not play a substantial role in the overall disparities, and being disciplined does not have a significant deleterious effect on students. And if we're willing to revise our assumptions based on the evidence, we should be utterly alarmed that our efforts to fix the school-to-prison pipeline has actually amplified it. I've spent the better part of a year collecting and analyzing evidence on the effects of discipline reform in major urban districts. Here's my current tally. Some of it is based on forthcoming work. Discipline reform has, according to students, made schools less safe and respectful in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Washoe County, which is Reno, its environs, Virginia Beach, and Seattle, which is still under OCR investigation. And if you look at these student surveys, it is very, very bad. It has done substantial academic harm to students in Los Angeles, Oakland, and Philadelphia, where truancy rose by 16% after the reform, probably because students were scared to come to school. Because whereas suspensions for conduct offenses were limited, suspensions for serious offenses rose. And because of that, the overall racial disparity rose. Now, it has not harmed students in Miami or Washington, D.C., but it has not happened there. Miami still warehouses students in off-site detention centers and does not call it suspending them. And in Washington, D.C., principals engaged in systematic fraud by suspending students and not telling their administrators. School surveys in Minneapolis and Madison do not show a deterioration, but those surveys do not extend back to before the reforms. Other teacher surveys and local coverage, however, paint a bleak picture. I am not aware of any district that has implemented a district-driven reform, has administered consistent surveys, and has not found a deterioration in student safety or respect. I appeal to everyone in this room who believes this to be a good idea to direct me towards that research as I'm trying to conduct a comprehensive national study of this question. We are on a very dangerous road. If teacher bias accounted for 100% of the disparity, as the previous administration directly alleged, or even a substantial share, then we could probably question their judgment without much consequence. But if it doesn't, if it encompasses a moderate to small share, then we're eliminating the fair and wise judgment of good and true people, and we should expect bad consequences. Because maybe teachers know better. Maybe they know more about how to manage their classrooms than the bureaucrats and activists who would blame them for society's problems and accuse them, teachers, of mass racial discrimination. Maybe, if we want to really do something about the school-to-prison pipeline, we should not issue coercive edicts that limit their thoughtful and prudent discretion. Maybe, just maybe, we should start trusting teachers again.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wilson?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. My name is Dan Lowson. I'm the director of the Center for Civil Rights Remedies at UCLA's Civil Rights Project. And I've been doing research on this particular area since 1999. But I should also point out that I'm a former teacher. I taught public school for 10 years. And I have a lot of empathy for teachers who kick kids out of the classroom, because I was that teacher. I was kicking kids out of my classroom right and left. I thought I had to demand respect from day one. And it was very frustrating. And I also would say my classroom bordered on chaos most days. I was also not always the best prepared teacher. My principal came back to me and said, Dan, you have a classroom management problem. And fortunately, I was in a district where they had training and support for young teachers like myself who were really dedicated to improving our practice. And by my 10th year, I never sent a single student to the principal's office. I didn't need to, because I found other ways through training and support to be an effective teacher without kicking kids out. So there's a lot that schools can do, and I know it from personal experience. And I would point out, if we go to the next slide, that there's a whole book on what works. It also contains some of the research showing that the impact of excessive disciplinary exclusion. But half the book is dedicated towards a range of different interventions, everything from restorative practices, social emotional learning, threat assessment in Virginia, and so on. One of the best studies is a randomized controlled study on class, and not on classroom management, on teacher training that was focused on engagement. So teachers, half the district, were trained in improving their engagement with their students, and half the teachers weren't. The ones that got the training, and it was a very rigorous, sustained training program, eliminated the racial disparities and almost eliminated all their classroom, their office referrals. So there's a lot that can be done, and there are things that are proven effective. I would point out that none of the studies in this book involve racial quotas, not a single one. They all had one thing in common, which was improving relationships. And so there is not there doesn't have to be a race-conscious piece even to some of the remedies that are very effective in reducing disparities. If we go to the next slide. That's a summary which I just gave. So let's, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip forward. Keep going. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. So one of the things that I'm glad this discussion is framed in terms of what is the impact on achievement of the racial disparities among kids with disabilities who are being excluded from the classroom. And we're not just talking about the discipline guidance, we're also talking about regulations that tell states to look at the district level for large racial disparities among kids with disabilities in terms of their discipline because of the concern about the impact on their achievement. I mean, I don't think any member of the panel would say that missing school somehow wouldn't likely impact your achievement. If you're not there the days of instruction and then you're tested in algebra on something you missed, obviously it's going to impact your learning. So I think it's sort of a no-brainer that removing kids unnecessarily would absolutely have an impact on achievement. But we also have research on this point. Studies of chronic absenteeism showed that missing 3 days of suspension in the month before the National Assessment of Education Progress in Reading lowered their grade level scores after controlling for other factors by a full grade level. So there's a tremendous impact of missing instruction. So let's go to the next slide and the next one. So why look at discipline in terms of days of missed instruction? Well, I think the answer is obvious, because the disparate impact is not just about who's being removed from school, but what happens, what do they miss? And I would point out that students with disabilities are receiving more. They're receiving OT, PT, they're receiving extra counseling, a whole range of special education and services. So when they are removed, if you remove 2 students for a dress code violation, one with disabilities and one without, the impact is going to be greater on the student with disabilities if it's for the same length of time, because they're getting more when they're in school. They're also losing more when they're out of school. We could go to the next slide. So we used data collected and reported to the public by the U.S. Department of Education, where they look at they put in ranges, the days of missed instruction. And we attributed values. So their ranges are students who just miss 1 day, 2 to 10, we multiplied that by 5. The average of 2 to 10 is 6, so this is a conservative estimate. And for more than 10 days, we attributed 11. So let's go to the next slide. So this is what we found. Across the nation, Black students with disabilities, K-12, missed 119 days of instruction per 100 enrolled. 119 days per 100 enrolled. That's outrageous right there. I don't think anyone on this panel would say that we should accept that as the status quo. Compare that to white students who missed 43 days, white students with disabilities missing 43 days. The disparity is 76 days more missed instruction per 100 enrolled for Black students with disabilities. There's an obvious impact on achievement. And our studies in Massachusetts, where we had the breakdown by why students were removed, 60% of the students with disabilities in Massachusetts who lost instruction because of discipline, 60% were for nonviolent, non-criminal, non-drug related offenses, a catch-all, category 18. So if we can go to the next slide. The other thing that's important, and this is sort of to look a response to James Scanlon research, but also about what to do. We have to measure how to reduce disparities and evaluate what's working in terms of reducing the rates for all students. This is really about good educational practice, common sense practice, improving instruction, reducing unnecessary suspensions. And when you do that, sometimes the risk ratios don't change, but the racial gap narrows, and that's what this slide shows. So I'll reserve no more time. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Dr. Morris?
Thank you, Madam Chair and Commissioners, for the opportunity to participate in this briefing. When discussing girls, instead of using the phrase school to prison pipeline, I use school to confinement pathways in order to uplift the policies, practices, conditions, and the prevailing consciousness that contribute to the criminalization of our students in ways that render them vulnerable to future contact with the criminal legal system along its continuum.
The National Black Women's Justice Institute, an organization for which I'm co-founder and president, recently released an analysis of 2013-14 school data collected by the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights. The report details the prevalence of African American, Latina, and white girls along the school continuum. In this report, and data shared in my written statement, the Institute found that Black girls with and without disabilities disproportionately experience discipline across the continuum. In my book, Push Out, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools, and other published articles and book chapters centering the educational experiences of Black girls and young women impacted by criminalization, I profile several girls with disabilities, those with physical disabilities, learning disabilities, and mental health conditions that informed their experiences in schools, and particular with school discipline. I anchor my work in ethnographic methods and narrative inquiry to breathe life and rigor into the lived experiences of our collective understanding of this phenomenon. We can use these qualitative data to better understand why there are racial and gender disparities in school discipline and how they manifest. And also, it can inform how we develop safe and responsive learning environments for all students. Overall, my work has found that for Black girls with and without diagnosed disabilities, critical pathways to school push-out include a reliance on school discipline in response to nonviolent student behavior, which unnecessarily removes girls from their classrooms and schools, differential dress code enforcement, which may lead to body shaming, body policing, chronic suspension, expulsion, school avoidance, and other forms of absence, gender-based violence on campus that often goes unaddressed, which may also lead to school avoidance and other physical altercations and/or assaults, increased surveillance, presence, and intervention of law enforcement and student disciplinary decisions and actions taken in schools, and a failure among adults in schools to recognize and respond to the trauma of Black girls and other girls of color, particularly among those with disabilities, when harm has been committed and symptoms manifest in the learning environment. Overall, there is a dearth of research that explores how attributional stereotyping of African American girls with disabilities may impact institutional responses to their behaviors, or the ways in which adverse childhood experiences or exposure to chronic stress impact their behaviors and performance in schools. What we do know is that the removal of girls from school renders them vulnerable to participation in underground economies. According to the Human Trafficking Pro Bono Legal Rights Center and the National Disabilities Rights Network, girls with disabilities are particularly vulnerable to sexual predators and traffickers who seek girls and young women with cognitive or developmental disabilities by stalking group homes and other facilities serving people with disabilities. For girls with disabilities, this form of exploitation and trauma often places them at risk of being in contact with law enforcement and/or the juvenile delinquency system, institutions that have been documented to have a limited capacity to respond to survivors of sexual violence. School districts, in partnership with educators, should develop and/or support a robust continuum of culturally competent and gender-responsive alternatives to suspension and expulsion. We know that education is a critical protective factor against contact with the criminal legal system, so we have to stop finding creative ways of treating certain children as disposable. PBIS has shown some positive impact on the behaviors of students with disabilities, but it is important to understand that being responsive to trauma also means developing strategies to address the institutional harms that trigger feelings of distrust and lack of safety, particularly among Black girls whose bodies and modes of expression are routinely misinterpreted as violent, as defiant, or as a disturbance to the school. Safer schools are those with a robust continuum of evidence-based and innovative practices that include restorative practices, counseling, mindfulness, yoga, training, and practical tools that emphasize empathic responses to student misbehavior. Every school district should implement equity policies that include a robust articulation of gender equity and student-focused responses to sexual assault, including specific supports for survivors with disabilities. I also recommend that school districts reduce school policing, and reinvest in educators. In Be Her Resource, a toolkit developed by the Georgetown Law Center on Poverty and Inequality and the National Black Women's Justice Institute, we call for specific activities, protocols, training, and training to increase law enforcement's capacity to engage effectively with girls of color, accounting for their layers of identity, including their ability, race, ethnicity, gender identity, and sexual orientation to the extent that they are present in schools. The last recommendation that I would like to share is that we invest in diversifying the teaching profession. Diversifying our nation's teaching force to include certified teachers of color with disabilities is part of how we increase the capacity of our educator workforce to improve its cultural awareness and responsiveness to the diversity of our nation's students. While I believe that most educators enter the profession because they genuinely believe in the promise of all children, this level of diversity can improve the ways in which girls with disabilities are treated in schools and thus the way they behave in schools. It is worth noting that a trauma-informed practice understands that for a person who has experienced a severe or extremely harmful event or series of events, there are certain behaviors, words, and conditions that trigger in her or him a negative reaction, reactions that are often responses to past abuses or neglect. Emotional safety is supported in learning spaces by emphasizing a respect for the diversity of thought and the rigor that comes from positive, appreciative reasoning and engagement with the student and material. Thank you for the opportunity to share these preliminary thoughts, and thank you for providing a platform to demonstrate that our commitment to uplift our girls with disabilities as sacred and loved are real.
Thank you, Dr. Morris. Dr. Morgan?
Thank you. It's an honor to be here for this panel. Next slide, please. I'll just be reviewing some of the peer-reviewed work that we've been conducting, most of which is peer-reviewed, some of which is currently going through peer review in regards to this topic. The work that I'm presenting in regards to disability identification has gone through a series of peer review processes in high-impact journals across a range of different fields, including in public health, sociology, and education. Next slide, please. This our findings have been reported on a number of different bipartisan organizations, Brookings, the Fordham Institute, New York Times, National Affairs, others. Next slide, please. And what we're essentially doing in terms of the intersectionality question regarding disability and race, we're examining to what extent do we find evidence that minority children are being inappropriately over-identified as disabled based on their race or ethnicity. And then second, in terms of some preliminary calculations I'm presenting today, we've been examining who's at risk for suspension, particularly in regards to the question of the intersection between disability and race. Next slide. Much of this work is relying on nationally representative data collected by the U.S. Department of Education and represents the best available evidence to investigate these questions. A unique feature of these data is they include student-level measures of potential confounds, including academic achievement, family socioeconomic status, school composition, and other explanatory factors. We're therefore able to approximate contrast between children who seem observationally similar in regards to their likelihood of being identified as having disabilities or their risk for suspension. Next slide, please. So are U.S. schools inappropriately over-identifying children disabled based on their race or ethnicity? Next slide. When we look at the national data in the fourth grade, and we break this down by individual level student achievement, we find that amongst children who are displaying a very low level of reading achievement, and so might reasonably be expected to be potentially having disabilities, that among similar achieving children, about 75% of white children have been identified in U.S. schools in fourth grade as having disabilities, with the contrasting percentages for minority children, Black, Hispanic, and American Indian children much lower. Next slide, please. When we look at this across the achievement distribution, these are the numbers I was just presenting. So what you see here is as children's achievement goes up, their likelihood of being identified as having disabilities in U.S. schools goes down. That makes sense. We see that across the different racial and ethnic groups that we examine. But within each row and across each similar level of academic achievement, we consistently find that white children and also English-speaking children are consistently more likely to be identified as having disabilities in schools, whether we examine this in 4th, 8th, or 12th grade, than otherwise similar achieving children who are racial and ethnic minorities. Next slide, please. I know this text is very small. If we look at this specific to different disability conditions, here we're looking at emotional behavior disorders. We've looked at this for ADHD, specific learning disabilities, specific language impairments, other health impairments, intellectual disabilities, other types of disability conditions that are very low prevalence. We consistently find initial evidence of over representation, similar to Ms. Harper was talking about, when we don't do adjusted estimates. But when we take into account potential explanatory factors, including those identified by National Research Council report expert panel in 2002, and correct the adjustments, the estimates for other potential explanatory factors, we consistently find that minority children in U.S. schools are less likely to be identified as having disabilities than otherwise similar children who are white or English speaking. And we've found that prior to school entry, after school entry, for special ed generally, across a range of different specific disability conditions, whether we use parent report or teacher report. And these findings are incredibly consistent with those that have been reported over the past several decades in public health, which also finds substantial disparities attributable to race or ethnicity amongst otherwise similar children displaying the same clinical needs. Next slide, please. If we chart this across time, beginning in 2003 up until the latest administration, the data we're examining here, this top line represents white children with their, amongst children with the estimates corrected for reading achievement at the individual student level. And what you find here is with all the other racial and ethnic groups are displaying numbers below 1 relative to whites. What does that mean? It means relative to similarly children peers, again, racial and ethnic minority children in the U.S. have been less likely to be identified as having disabilities, beginning in 2003, when this data began to be available, up until the latest administration of these data, which also includes 2015, the most recently available. Next slide, please. If you look at this across the the economic distribution of U.S. schools, here what we've done, the two lines represent the percent of fourth grade children who are identified as having needing special services, whether the children are white or black. What you see here is that you see the two lines, and what happens is as the school's economic disadvantage increases, both groups, white and blacks, displaying relatively similar levels of academic achievement, experience declining likelihoods of being identified as having disabilities. But you also always see a disparity between white and black children in regards to the relative percentage of children who are being identified as having disabilities. Next slide, please. So that's looking at the intersection between disability and race generally. Now let's look a little bit more specifically in regards to suspension. Next slide, please. So what we see here when we estimate a regression equation on who's likely to be suspended, yes or no, we find with uncorrected estimates that children who are black are more likely to be suspended by the end of 8th grade than children who are white, with minimal correction for some confounds. We also see initially that children with disabilities are more likely to be suspended. However, when we correct the estimates for other potential explanatory factors, including individual level behavior measured at the start of kindergarten, we find that black children relative to similar children who are white remain more likely to be suspended, but children with disabilities are not, nor are children with disabilities who are of color are not. There is no really significant interaction here. Next slide, please. When we look at this specific to how many times the students have been suspended, we find the same pattern. Children who are black are more likely to experience more suspensions. Not children with disabilities or children with disabilities who are racial and ethnic minorities are not at greater risk for suspension. So next slide. Our results indicate disparities attributable to discriminatory practices. In regards to disability identification, schools seem to be more likely to identify children who are white or English speaking relative to otherwise similar children who are racial and ethnic minorities. Minority children are more likely to be suspended, but children with disabilities don't seem to be more likely to be suspended after accounting for potential confounds, and we see that same finding in regards to the interaction between race and disability.
Thank you, Dr. Morgan. Thank you. So I'll open up for questions from my fellow commissioners. Commissioner Arasaki.
Thank you, Mr. Lawson, or Dr. Lawson, sorry. In your written testimony, you have a lot of discussion about the actual issue about whether schools are in fact feeling safer or not safer who are trying to undergo reform, which seem to be at odds with Dr. Eden's observation. So I'm wondering if you could expound on that.
Yeah, so one of the studies in our book looked at students in Chicago, for example, and they looked at students who were attending schools in the highest crime neighborhoods. And they found that the schools that had the highest safety measures among those schools were ones that were really engaged in building trust between teachers and students and teachers and parents. Now it also happens, now this is correlational, not causation, but all those schools were much lower suspending. So in other words, the higher safety ratings in those types of schools were ones that suspended fewer students. I'd also point out that even Max Eden's own report, if you look at Mayor Bloomberg's reforms, suspensions declined dramatically during Mayor Bloomberg's sort of control over the schools there. And there was no change in school climate, according to Max Eden's own studies. So the idea that when we reduce suspensions, that there has to be chaos as a result is absolutely not supported even by the researchers who are claiming that is the case. And I would also point out that Eden's study, when you look at individual schools, did not find a correlation between lowering the suspensions. The schools that lowered suspensions didn't look different in terms of the changes in climate than the schools that stayed the same or increased suspensions. So the idea that reducing suspensions breeds chaos is not supported even by those researchers who are trying to make that claim. And lastly, I've been going around the country working with Dr. Skiba and other researchers to find good examples of schools that are more effective. And these schools are often are in high crime neighborhoods. And there are schools that have very low suspension rates. Some have dramatically declined. Others have been low for a long time. And they all seem to have the same thing in common. They really invest in kids. They care about kids. They go to extra measures to make sure that students have the supports they need. They develop relationships. You talk to the security guards in those buildings and the school police. It's all about developing relationships and giving students second and third chances. And those are very orderly schools. And there are very low suspension rates. There are alternatives to kicking kids out right and left for all kinds of offenses that work very effectively. And the last thing is this assumption that we have order when we kick out a lot of kids is not supported in the research. The study that often gets pointed to is one in Florida, Alachua County, Florida, where they say, you know, this idea that you can expose students more to disruptive peers. Well, guess what? That was a study of the second highest suspending district in the county in the state of Florida. So during that period, that was a very high suspending county where there was this cost associated with, and the disruptive peers were students who had domestic violence, had been exposed to domestic violence. So the idea that you would kick out more kids who've been exposed to violence in their home or traumatized as a solution makes no sense whatsoever. I think what that study stands for is that if we don't have some sort of trauma intervention and support kids who come from troubled situations, then we do get more disruption. But that would be an intervention that doesn't, you know, kicking a kid out of school is a non-intervention. It's less adult involvement with the child, not more. And it doesn't work. And there is no research that says it works.
Speaking to floor as well.
Yeah, kind of want to take that point by point, right? We have to be very careful of drawing assumptions from studies and try to parse out exactly what they tell us. Dan's study of Chicago showed us, well, the study he referred to showed us that good schools are good. I can 100% buy that. A study by the University of Chicago Schools Consortium of the effects of lowering suspensions from 10 days to 5 found a causal deterioration in student respect and teacher-reported disruptive behavior. Regarding my work in New York City, Dan is absolutely correct that Bloomberg lowered suspensions by 16,000 and saw no negative effects. We have to think about what the reform was. That reform was a teacher may not kick out a student for the first time that he commits a low-level infraction. That seems very sensible to me. It seems very sensible you could eliminate those and see no bad consequences. The second reform was that if a teacher wants to suspend a student, they have to ask the principal to ask the administration for permission, knowing that the principal doesn't want to ask and the administration doesn't want to give. I posit that that creates a very different dynamic that will undercut teachers across the board. It is true that there was not a direct correlation. It was an across-the-board thing. However, when you see a series of across-the-board policy changes in multiple cities, and you see a series of across-the-board deteriorations, it should raise eyebrows.
Thank you. I just have one short follow-up. So trying to parse and read between the lines of when statistics is not my forte, I kind of go against the stereotype of Asians in terms of numbers. Is it the case that the question is not whether to do this, but how well it gets done? How much investment there are in teacher training, how much gaming is being done by principals as opposed to investing in the real work of supporting teachers in the classrooms in order to create a better learning environment for all kids. So,
if I could respond to that, yes. And I think one area of agreement that I would have with Max Eden is that we look at the school climate surveys, because safety is a non-negotiable. And so I get upset when folks falsely attribute to those discipline reform proponents like myself to say that we would trade off somehow with safety. Absolutely not. You know, we are teachers, we are parents, we are students. These are our schools, and that's not on the table. And safety also means safety from bigotry, from unfair and unjust educational environments.
Yeah, I would just want to offer one that I fully agree with the element of how we're defining safety and the core and critical need to redefine that. I also want to say that it's very important to support participatory action research that engages the affected population in understanding and interpreting these data and understanding the conditions that are taking place in our schools, not just with educators and other adults, but also with young people who are active participants in the co-construction of their learning and who are able to sit with us as partners in understanding what they need to feel safe, how they need responses to be engaged, such that they are responsive to them and at the intersection of their identities. This is a discussion about intersectionality, and so it's important for us not to just say the intersections of race and disability and leave it at that, but to understand that there are multiple intersections informing a student's understanding of safety and our need to critically examine that.
Commissioner Clyde.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like anybody who wants to answer this question to answer this question. I think I'm specifically looking at these two gentlemen, but I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in. But both Mr. Lucen and Mr. Eden, these studies that you cited, I looked at your little presentation and I listened to it, and I looked at the footnotes, and it looks like you just went through the numbers. Is that right? Of these school districts that you say have gotten worse
Yes,
since they've instituted this policy?
I have.
I just
Sure. Sorry.
okay. So I just wanted to know that. I'm not going to be critical or anything, but in looking at these studies and the studies that y'all have used, have you taken into account the types of training and the differences in training between school districts? Because we have so many school districts, they don't use the same type of training and institute the same level of command, like you were speaking about New York, I think, with the whatever. And that's not in every school district. So how can you, is it fair to compare just numbers without looking at what school districts do inside themselves to effectuate training on how to institute discipline and how teachers respond and principals and administrators and the school cops?
I think it's important to frame this issue in terms of students' rights to educational opportunity. So if there are some schools with the same resources that are kicking students out right and left, and then right around the corner, there are schools with the same resources that are not, and those students are engaged, and there isn't a safety problem. In fact, most of the time, those schools have higher achievement and higher graduation rates. Then it really behooves us to say, there's a right to equal access to educational opportunity. And we should prompt the schools that are really doing an inefficient job. And I point out we have other studies to show that there's a huge economic cost when we kick kids out of school, because it does contribute, it predicts a much higher dropout or lower graduation rate. So So to answer your question,
That doesn't answer my question.
well, so the resources can be spent differently, and that's something that is that what you're asking about? Or
No, I'm trying to get at, when you look at these numbers, you have to look behind the numbers to see, you have how many school districts in the country? 2,000, 3,000, 5,000?
14,000.
Okay. 18,000 police departments, 14,000 school districts.
A lot of commissioners with questions.
I think it's 16.
But my question is, do you look behind those numbers to see in those 14,000 school districts, or however many have instituted or looked at this guidance letter and tried to institute this program of less suspensions and less expulsions, the training and how it has affected people? I mean, some districts may be able to train may have a better program than other districts. There may be a model program, and that's what I'm looking for.
Yes.
And I'm not hearing anything.
So I think the Texas study tracked every middle school student for 6 years, and they looked at school effects, and they found that what schools do make a difference. In other words, it's not an external problem that schools can't control. I hope that addresses what you're saying, that there are things schools can do, and some do it well and some do it very poorly, that contributes to whether there are large racial disparities. The leadership matters a great deal. So you can train principals to be, competent in terms of cultural awareness and cultural competency, and to really address discipline as an educational issue to help kids, prevent the misbehavior and keep kids in school as much as possible. That doesn't mean they don't suspend students when there's a safety issue. And those differences make a huge difference. Those school level differences do drive a lot of the racial disparities. So the idea that there's a less discriminatory alternative is often the school next door.
So given that the subject of this panel is in large part relevant to federal policy, I think it is entirely fair to try to examine every instance where we have data where that federal policy has shifted practices and see what has happened in those districts. And the results, as I have said, have been, to my best of my knowledge, uniformly bad. Now, what happens when you look under the hood to kind of figure out what's going on and try to assess any differences we see between districts? There's some of that out there, right? One thing that we see almost invariably, perhaps invariably, is that this notion that we need to phase out exclusionary discipline and implement restorative practices or positive behavioral intervention supports, it kind of doesn't actually happen, right? A tool from teachers is taken away rather instantly or severely limited rather instantly. And then over a long period of time in a select group of schools, additional supports are given. In LA, after the first 2 years, I think it was 10% of schools. In New York, after 2 years, I think it was 6% of schools. In Philadelphia, after 4 years, I think it was 5% of schools. So what is happening in districts that I believe is driving the uniform decline is
Sorry, could you pause for just, I didn't understand what was not happening.
A rollout of district-supported, funded positive behavioral intervention support programs. A tool is taken away across the board, and a replacement is given to 10% or fewer schools within that district. And we do not have great studies on what happens in those schools versus that. A study in Philadelphia that just came out a few weeks ago does not paint a nice picture.
Point out that in Los Angeles, in fact, if you follow what happened in 4 years after the changes were implemented, they have the highest sense of safety ratings that they've ever had. They have higher graduation rates, achievement improved across the board. And if we look at multiple indicators rather than cherry pick one or two that went down for 1 year, if we really look at the whole set of indicators, we get a very different picture, one of mostly success. Now, Los Angeles is the second largest school district in the country. Within Los Angeles, there are problem schools, no doubt. But the general picture is one of success and not failure.
Thank you. Commissioner Harriet?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Eden, when you came up and introduced yourself over the break, I said I'd like to ask you a question on disability and discipline. It's actually the question that I didn't get a chance to answer. I didn't get a chance to ask in the previous panel. Since then, Dr. Morgan has also spoken on this issue. and he may want to comment too. But my point was going to be that one of the panelists had said that disabled students have much higher levels of discipline than other students. And I think what people think when they hear that is that students in wheelchairs are getting disciplined more often than other students. But I think there's actually different kinds of disability involved here. So could you comment on that?
So we need to kind of not look at raw aggregate numbers. If there's one thing we learned from James and from Dr. Morgan, it's that aggregate numbers aren't always revealing. The Center for State Government Justice Center issued a report in 2011, which is pretty comprehensive, and it tried to break down suspension rates, controlling for various demographic factors by the type of disability. And it found, and it's in my testimony, I'm going to be approximate here, students with physical disabilities were 50% less likely to be suspended. Students with autism were 30% less likely. Students with significant developmental disabilities were about 15% less likely. Students with learning disabilities were about 2.1% more likely. And students with emotional disturbance were about 20% more likely. Now, emotional disturbance is a category catch-all for problems that cannot be medically diagnosed, but there seems to be something wrong here because there is bad behavior. So when we see that there are a higher rate of students with emotional disturbance who are being disciplined, it is entirely opaque as to the extent to which that involves discrimination or the fact that students who are more likely to misbehave and misbehave often are more likely to be punished for misbehavior.
If I could also respond to that. So it is true, if you look at the data, that students with emotional disturbance are more likely than other students, but if you look at all the others, about twice as likely. But the law says we're not allowed to suspend students because of their disability. And so I think what we're really seeing is likelihood that students with disabilities that have emotional disturbance are not having their educational and their emotional needs met the way they're supposed to. So they can be in a more restricted placement if that's necessary. But what you can't do is kick kids out because of their disability. That's unlawful. But I'd also point out that students with emotional disturbance are less than 10% of all kids with disabilities. And what we're seeing, and I would point out that there are states such as Nebraska, where students with disabilities who are Black lost over 200 days of instruction due to disciplinary removal, compared to, I think it was 46 for white students. And so there is a federal law in IDEA requires that we look at not just state level, but actually at district level. And I guarantee you that in Nevada, there will be districts that those disparities and those high rates are even higher because, the state is an aggregate average. So it's really important to keep that policy in place, because all it's saying is to look at the data, and when there are these really large differences, require some comprehensive, coordinated, early intervening services. And the other thing that the regulations do, it says we can use the funds to address the problem. So the kids that are getting kicked out unnecessarily, in those districts, the funds can be used for kids with disabilities. It made that clear, and that's a really important clarification. And I point out also that these regulations, 238 districts were identified because of racial disparities in discipline in special ed. That was the highest number of districts. So it wasn't mostly about identification or restricting this as placement. We're seeing this phenomenon, where states attend to it, it's gone through the roof. There are many, but unfortunately, of the places where the racial disparities are the largest, in those 10 states, only 4 of them identified any districts. That means 6 states with these huge racial disparities, including Nevada and Nebraska, Ohio, identified no districts, none whatsoever. And so the regulations were also intended to help make sure that the monitoring of this problem is done better than it had been.
Mr. Eden, I want to make sure you have a chance just to respond to the point that Mr. Lawson was just making about federal law and discipline of students with disabilities.
Yeah, no, I mean, he is still on, sorry about that. No, he's absolutely correct on the law. I think that the question here for us to consider as we try to figure out ways to interpret the law and to execute the law from an administrative function, right, is how much of what we're seeing is discrimination and how much we're seeing how much of those numbers are inflated by other factors. And depending on our relative estimate of how much is real and how much is conflated, that should certainly inform the executive functions of enforcing U.S. law.
Thank you. Ms. Morris? Dr. Morris?
So I think it's important for us to elevate in this conversation how oppression manifests. Oppression manifests structurally, individually, culturally, and in internalized ways. Knowing that, we cannot say that schools as institutions cannot be biased. Knowing that, we know that there are tools, that there are ways for us to support the capacity of educators, of districts, of institutions, and their partners to respond the way that we think that they should be responding based upon the data and research that we have been engaged in. And as practitioners and with students, as I said before, able to construct something that is much more responsive to these underlying issues that researchers tend to point to but never clearly identify as being as impacting the capacity of our institutions to provide services for young people with disabilities. The importance of developing structured decision-making tools to help engage educators so that they can be responsive to the specific needs of students does help to improve the outcomes, to allow for them to be responsive when there are acts that are conflicting acts on campus, to respond to incidents of trauma, to engage their own capacity to ask questions in ways that will be responsive to children. I am personally less interested in how we parse numbers to see if students are being disproportionately impacted as much as I am concerned that all students are receiving equitable treatment in these institutions and that the outcomes reflect that. So when we look at how we're able to engage in this work, it's important for us to think about one student being too many. And if one student is too many, then that means that we have to do something differently. If one classroom is not functioning with the degree of competence and engagement to be as responsive as it can to all children at the intersections of their identity, to reduce and mitigate racial, gender, and disability bias, then we're not doing enough. So, I think there are tools that we know to be existing. We know that exclusionary discipline really does just displace the problem, and these kids come back into the classroom further aggravated from the conditions that they were exposed to in the street. We see these kids show up in detention centers. We see these kids show up in other carceral conditions that reduce their capacity to return to school, or that reduce their capacity to be engaged as learners and scholars that we know they can be, and that is problematic. And so the extent to which we can engage in the development of tools, guidance, training, technical assistance, rigorous engagement of participatory methods so that we include those who are impacted by these conditions in the conversation about these conditions are all important to our development of a capacity to be as responsive as we can.
Thank you. Commissioner Dagley?
Thank you. Dr. Morris, I'm interested that many people have testified about the extent to which trauma affects a fair number of our students in our educational system. And I think it doesn't strain the imagination to think that hurt people, and may in fact act out in ways that are manifestations of their lived experience. And so I'm interested to have you lay out for us in a little bit more granular detail whether the positive behavioral interventions and support, sort of how they work, whether they work, and whether or not these things are scalable in a way that can embrace our children to put them on a path to success rather than excluding them and putting them on a path to the criminal justice system.
Thank you. In my review of positive behavioral systems, intervention systems and supports, I think there have been opportunities for us to look at tiers of intervention that are aimed to modify student behavior and to engage students in the practice of understanding how we support their capacity to behave in classrooms the way that adult expectations have been crafted for them to behave in classrooms. A lot of that is reflective of our social norms around what we perceive to be acceptable behavior, and a lot of that has to do with how we want to prepare our young people to be active participants as learners in the classroom, and also ultimately active participants in society. I think that positive behavioral interventions are limited in their capacity to address the structural biases that further exacerbate harms in the lives of young people. The way that I talk about this ultimately is that there have been institutions and sometimes individuals, but if we think about this along the structural framework, there have been institutions that have been part of a tapestry of harm in the lives of certain communities, and that given that they have been part of this tapestry of harm, some of the engagements and the way that they present in the lives of young people can be problematic. So if there has been a historical legacy of these institutions causing harm in a community or not being responsive to a particular community, when that institution presents itself as being the panacea to a crisis, there may be a limited trust in the community being impacted to respond to these interventions. That's one of the reasons that I think is critically important to engage in partnerships with those who do have the established trust to help apply some of the structures and to engage in measures of student performance, and particularly around behaviors, such that we're not measuring these behaviors according to any personal bias, implicit or explicit, that we may bring to these activities. One of the things that I said in my statements here to you today was that the behaviors, particularly of Black girls, are misinterpreted as defiant and violent and disruptive, and sometimes those are just expressions of their critical thinking. But based upon, some of the ways in which we have portrayed Black femininity in our society, the way that those words come out, or the very act of dissent, is perceived as an act of defiance. And so until we do that hard work to unpack what we're talking about when we say we want students' behaviors to improve, or we want to set up a set of measures to engage, and there's some, or to engage in the development of a uniform practice, I think that we've got more work to do to repair relationships, not just between individuals, but between individuals and institutions. So with positive behavioral interventions, my belief is that's one strategy that can be used to address the box. But we also have to understand that there are some individual things that need to happen within that box to help increase the capacity of these institutions to be more responsive to students who are particularly vulnerable to exclusionary discipline, and who are particularly vulnerable to other harms in connection with that exclusionary discipline.
Ms. Reed.
In the earlier panel, I heard a lot of the federal experts say that we know what works and we need to shift away from exclusionary discipline to positive behavioral intervention supports. I unfortunately had an involuntary reaction to believe that we don't necessarily know it that much. I say that because the most comprehensive literature review came to the conclusion that this can work, but it requires extensive buy-in from teachers, it requires outside funding, and it requires a lot of time. So it is true that it can work, but that something can work does not mean that it will work. The record of it in the real world as it's trying to be implemented is mixed to negative. A federal grant, the Safe and Supportive Schools grant, which gave high schools extra money to implement, it was mixed. Some better, some worse. Wisconsin kind of negative, California pretty good. But the record of this being implemented in school districts as other forms of discipline are being taken away from teachers is, to my reading, quite negative. A recent study of Philadelphia by the Center for Policy Research and Education found that, again, 30 schools, 3 years into the reform, had actually received extra support for these services. Every other school was told, you are on your own. In these 30 schools, teachers were no more likely to say that their principal was better at handling discipline than in the other schools. They were no less likely to suspend students than the other schools. There were a lot of anecdotal reports of teachers saying that they did not believe their administrators, teacher-administrator strife and dissent, which is not a pathway to a productive and collaborative school climate. And to me, the most interesting thing was, whereas 70% of teachers said that they had received the consistent message from their school administrators that suspensions do not work, 80% of teachers said that they do. 65% of teachers said that they deter future misbehavior. which is in the advocate and activist community, established as a pure falsehood, yet 65% of teachers believe it. So as we try to figure out what works, I think we need to give a lot more credit to the judgment of teachers as it has been informed by years of practice and personal experience, than trying to take pilot studies that are not like the situations we are looking at and say, because that works, this will.
I would just like to offer that every intervention requires teacher buy-in. Every intervention requires student buy-in. So we can't use that as the measure of understanding our success. We have to understand that that's a critical core component of intervention.
I'd just like to point out that both the NEA and the AFT support taking measures and addressing racial disparities in discipline, especially because of its disparate impact on loss of instructional time. We are talking about also, I remind folks, the rights of students, educational opportunity that differs dramatically, especially with Black students compared to white students with disabilities. We're talking about hundreds of days of lost instruction and differences. And to me, we should start with, that's unacceptable. And then we'll figure out what works. And it's important to have good research and to continually improve what we're doing. But the status quo is unacceptable. And I don't think we can just stand by and say, well, we'll wait until, you know, X, Y, or Z happens before we prompt schools to do something differently. Because right now, students with disabilities who are Black are having their educational opportunity denied.
Commissioner Chrisman?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This has been very stimulating and informative. I appreciate all the hard work all of you put into it. Our charter as the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights is to investigate and analyze disparities based on discrimination based on protected classes such as race, disability. We are not a commission of best educational practices. And so it strikes me, I've been sitting here for a couple of hours now, and I see Dr. Morgan's last 2 bullet points there. And those really address what we're here for today. We do not observe that children with disabilities are more likely to be suspended, and we do not observe that among children with disabilities, those who are racial or ethnic minorities are more likely to be suspended. Does anyone have any empirical data that refutes those 2 bullet points?
Yes. So I would say all the wealth of the research definitely refutes that, including the findings that I have presented today. So absolutely. And I'd also point out that, you know, Dr. Morgan is using samples that, if it was the ELS study, it's a survey of parents about whether students were suspended. So he's not actually using suspension data. He's using what, you know, survey respondents said, whether or not their child was suspended. So there's a big difference in terms of, we know what the disparities look like. And the other point is that Dr. Morgan's studies don't include a single district. So we're seeing a huge range of what's happening at the district level. And there are huge disparities that have been addressed by the Office for Civil Rights, by the Department of Justice. Sometimes it's intentional discrimination. Sometimes there are structural factors. Oftentimes implicit bias may be one of the many factors. But I really think that it's important to also look at what is sound educational practice is important to this question. Because if you are pursuing something that is unsound and counterproductive, and it also has a disparate impact on students with disabilities or Black children or a confluence of those, or Black boys or Black girls, then it's imperative that we do something differently, that we don't accept the status quo when it's an unsound practice. Now, with example in the guidance, for example, is suspending students for truancy. I don't see the argument that that's a deterrent. These students are not coming to school, yet they're being suspended for not coming to school. Now they're being told you can't come. It makes no sense. A dress code violation.
Stay on point with responding to Commissioner Kirsten's question,
Yes.
which is empirical data. And I think you've answered
Yes,
that.
okay.
I do want to say, I understand, Dr. Morgan, that you had been trying to get in, and this question seems to be about you. So I apologize for that. And if you want to.
It's however I can be helpful. So in regards to our analyses, most of the available studies that have looked at, there's the disparities point and then there's the discrimination point. So we're not contesting the disparities point. We're wondering, what's the evidence of discrimination? So if you look at children who observationally look similar, who is more or less likely to experience the outcome. When we look at disability identification, we consistently find that white children are more likely to be identified as having disabilities, despite being otherwise similar to racial and ethnic minorities, displaying similar levels of academic achievement, family economic resources. We also find this amongst children attending the same schools, so would have access presumably to the same level of school level resources. In the last set of regressions, which are preliminary, we are correcting for limitations in the prior empirical knowledge base. Many of the studies that have looked at does identification as having a disability in and of itself, do schools consider that kind of a red flag for suspending students, net of other potential explanatory factors? Most of the available studies have not considered prior behavior, or they haven't considered prior economic disadvantage, or the quality of the schools that the students are attending. So in these preliminary regressions, we've tried to account for those alternative explanations. We do find that children who are Black are more likely to be suspended compared to otherwise similar children who are white. But we don't find that that extends to being identified as having a disability. We don't find it extends to the interaction between being identified as having a disability and being a racial and ethnic minority, whether in this case Black or Hispanic. And to an earlier point, we've also looked at whether this risk is observed amongst specific disability conditions, emotional behavior disorders, learning disabilities, etc. And we also fail to find elevated risk, whether it's measured by suspension, yes or no, or by the number of times being suspended in terms of that interaction, or in terms, excuse me, of that identification label. The other thing I'd note is...
Can we pause on that for just a moment, just to make sure I understand?
Sure.
Is it fair that your point is that students should be compared like to like? And so the degree to which they've had prior disciplinary infractions should be part of that calculus, or am I misunderstanding?
It's in my understanding is if we're looking at discrimination, we're looking at comparing otherwise similar students who experience different outcomes.
Yes, thank you.
Or we're looking at possibly disparate impact. So we're looking at here at children who are observationally similar and including into their prior behavior about their likelihood of being suspended.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think I cut you off as you were getting to another point.
The other thing I was going to note is a notable contribution of our study is we look at the frequency of suspension. So suspension, yes or no, is a bad thing, but being suspended often is known to increase the likelihood of later arrest by a significant degree. So that is a concern in terms from the standpoint of the school to prison pipeline, which I believe the hearing is on. So we find that to be the case for children who are African American, but we don't find it in regards to, again, to disability or the interaction between the two.
Dr. Morris, thank you.
Yes, I mentioned in my comments, and it's provided in the written statement, that the National Black Women's Justice Institute conducted a study, or took the data that were collected by the Department of Education to examine what was occurring among girls. Oftentimes what happens with girls with disabilities is obscured when they are included in larger bodies. What we did is compare just girls to other girls who are similarly situated, to your point. And we found that among students served under IDEA, the Institute found that African American girls were 4 times as likely as white girls to experience 1 or more out of school suspension, and nearly 3 times as likely to experience 1 or more in-school suspensions. That African American girls with disabilities were 2.5 times more likely than white girls with disabilities to be referred to law enforcement, and almost 4 times as likely to be arrested on campus. There are important distinctions for us to understand what is leading to some of those interactions, but to answer your question about whether we have found differential impact of these practices, we have.
Thank you.
If I could just point out one concern about Morgan's analysis is when you control for prior behavior, it assumes that there was no racial bias either structurally or implicitly in those prior assessments, whether they're teacher evaluations or whether they're actual discipline, incidents of discipline. So why would we think that in 8th grade, for example, there is a racial disparity that might be due to bias of some sort, but treat everything that happened before as if no bias existed? That doesn't make sense. That you're controlling for the thing you're trying to measure. So I would disagree with that analysis.
Multiple commissioners with questions pending, but I see that you want to get in.
So again, the bias could certainly occur in previous things. We should also try to assess the degree to which we think that explains it, right? A 2014 study by John Paul Wright found that previous behavior explained it. It also, that is open to that criticism. It is entirely open to that criticism. The interesting subpoint of that study, which isn't remarked upon, is that teacher-reported misbehavior was a far weaker predictor of suspensions than parents-reported misbehavior. So I would just like to make another point that if we look at the relative contributions that parent perception and teacher perception make, I think it argues strongly against strong teacher bias.
Just to quickly respond to that. So this Wright study was not based on actual suspension data. Again, it was asking parents, had their child ever been suspended? So these are 8th grade students, any time before 8th grade. But the prior sort of impressions, he ruled out the fact that a lot of black children are suspended in grades K through 3. So he has an assumption that this is all prior impressions of behavior, but not describing actual. So he's really conflated the two. So it doesn't make any sense in terms of, you know, the validity. And again, he's not looking at 8th grade suspension rates. It's the question is, was your child ever suspended? So, and he is assuming.
Stop us here and move on. Thank you, Vice Chair.
Thank you very much. We began this briefing with words like, with regard to discipline policy, schools must get it right. But where there seems to be some divergence of thought is whether federal policies help. In fact, it was stated earlier that the Dear Colleague letter was wrong-headed. Before we close, I thought it might be good for us to discuss what are the reasons that federal policy makers should stay the course on DOJ and OCR joint guidance, and include in any response, what do you think would result if we were to rescind current policy? So I open that up. Dr. Morris, Dr. Lucen, Mr. Eaton.
So just quickly, one of the things, I've been going to schools and districts around the country to figure out what really works, combine mixed methods, qualitative as well as quantitative. And every single school and district that is doing effective work, where there is both order and students are doing well achievement-wise and very low suspension rates and very low levels of disparities, they all start by looking at the data. And this is what the guidance is really asking schools to do, is look at your data to see if there are large racial disparities, and if some of them are due to suspending kids for truancy or for dress code violations or unnecessary kinds of misbehaviors, typical adolescent misbehaviors, that there are things you can do to stop that. There are less discriminatory alternatives. It's just asking the question to prompt that investigation.
Excuse me, when you say look to the guidance.
So the guidance, the joint OCR DOJ guidance prompts every school and every district to look at their data and ask these questions. It does not direct them to do anything more than that. And that's where the inquiry begins. But if they can't justify what they're doing, and it's a large racial disparities, they should find alternatives. And then it provides a whole host of resources about a range of things they can do differently.
Yes, I will add that, excuse me, the collection of data, particularly as it's disaggregated in ways that are useful to schools to clearly understand where there are particular decision points that might inform practice, have inspired several courageous conversations, I will say, that are taking place in districts across the country. I too have been moving through districts and looking at what schools are doing with the existing guidance, the previous guidance, and what they're doing with the growing body of research that has been showing, offering suggestions. And a number of them are engaged in new conversations that were not previously there that have resulted in policy changes, including the elimination of suspensions for K through 2, including looking at how they can implement a more robust continuum of alternatives to suspension and expulsion for younger kids, particularly for kids of color who are disproportionately impacted by decision-making among educators and institutions that are reading behaviors in ways that reflect implicit biases. And they're doing that hard work of examining what it is that is leading to some of these disparities. And without that guidance, I don't know that they necessarily would have been inspired to do so. I don't know that they necessarily would have felt that they had the support to do so. And I don't necessarily think that they would call upon people who are writing and investigating these issues and really trying to seek solutions to be partners with them in their school districts to develop alternatives. Dr. Morgan?
I was just going to add to the point about disability identification. IDEA was amended in 1997, again in 2004. The focus was on relative percentages in different in terms of disparity, which was taken as evidence of discrimination. The equity and IDEA regulations expanded that. There's no accounting for differences in clinical need in those regulations. Schools aren't asked to examine, okay, let's look at these disparities in regard, once we take into account children who are displaying the same clinical need. They much more operate as relative numbers. Keep track of this number and let's tell us if you're going over it. Our analyses of this problem in regard specifically to disability identification for minorities repeatedly indicates that's not the problem, that schools are instead systematically not identifying children who display similar clinical need based on their race ethnicity. And so that is much clearer evidence of widespread discriminatory practice in the US, but is not addressed currently under federal legislation or regulation.
I think you mean it specifically under the IDEA, as distinct from civil rights laws. The other civil rights laws. Thank you. Okay, Mr. Eden.
Yeah, the 2014 Dear Colleague guidance must be rescinded. To the extent to which the elements are collecting statistics for schools and letting them know that is going to stay. The Trump administration has already decided that is going to stay. The extent to which the guidance was trying to collect and disseminate best practices, that is also going to stay. The question is, to what extent will the federal government swoop into school districts and coerce them to change their practices? That is the element that must go. There was a three-part test that was used and spelled out in the guidance. Does a disparity exist? Is it absolutely necessary for an educational need? And are there other means available? Now, that is the legal test for these kinds of things. That is a legal test that is intended to be applied in a court of law by a judge, not by a federal bureaucrat who, as Ms. Harriet opened, the judgment of which we have no particular reason to trust, right? So these investigators came in, they made policy shifts, and they did not leave. At the close of the Obama administration, I think the numbers on the website, there were 387 open cases. By my count, which might not be accurate, so I don't want to stand by it, I think that they closed 32 cases in the last 4 years. So to the extent to which the guidance was federal investigators swoop in, use their own judgment to second guess local educators, that's the element that must go.
1 second, please, Madam Chair. I don't want to testify. I want other folks to testify, but for what I've read, there would be a good bit of disagreement with what you just said. Dr. Lowson, if you'd like, quickly, I just want to
truly quickly, because Commissioner Narasaki and I both have questions. Thank you.
Okay, just quickly.
The bottom line is that the guidance prompts educators to do the right thing by kids, to do what works. And if something is unproductive, counterproductive, educationally unsound, and it has a disparate impact based on disability or race, that they have to change those practices. And it's not actually, it's an administrative guidance, I'd point out. It's not for lawyers. You can't go to court using the disparate impact regulations. So it's not a court decision, and it shouldn't be. Educators need that to be prompted.
We really do have to, if you could follow that up with anything written you'd like to submit.
Thank you. Commissioner Narasaki.
Yeah, I wanted to make a point and then I'll ask a question to be followed up in writing. My point is that actually it seems to me that the data that Dr. Morgan threw up that shows that in fact African Americans are being under-identified for disability actually is why we are here. Because if that is true, then that means that teachers dealing with these kids aren't taking into account that it may be coming from a disability from which this kid needs support. And perhaps those behaviors would stop if those kids were identified and got the support they needed. Is that correct, Dr. Morgan?
Your mic is off.
That's correct, and there is some empirical work to support that once you receive the disability identification and access treatment, it lowers your likelihood of entering the school to prison pipeline.
Great, and I would ask this panel, as I did the previous panel, if you have ideas for how that can be fixed, how we can be better at identifying, that'd be great. The second thing that I know we don't have time because I want the chair to be able to ask a question is many people have identified that IDEA that schools are not using their resources, which blows my mind because schools are so under-resourced. So I haven't heard or seen anything about how can we get those schools? What's the federal government's role in trying to get those schools to actually use those resources? And I would love you to have brief us in writing. Thank you.
Could I just very quickly respond that it's important to note that Dr. Morgan's research does not look at any districts. And we're really talking about district
We're not going to
effects.
criticize the research any further. Thank you. Thank you. So I have a point of privilege. My last question. I know the Commissioner, at least Commissioner Cladney, also had another question. So I will just say to you all, thank you very much. This was obviously a popular topic among us. So far as I know, the research that all of you rely on does not include examining the climate surveys that are a standard feature of OCR's resolution agreements. And so, Mr. Eden, you asked at the beginning if there's other research that could answer the question of how schools are responding, how students feel after schools have implemented particular reforms. I would invite you all to take a look at those climate surveys. I think that they are a rich data source. I looked before coming today to see how much of that is public, and not so much of it is publicly reported, but it is FOIable, so I invite you to try to access it. But I did see that the Amherst County Public Schools reports increase in student safety multiple years after OCR, student perception of safety, multiple years after OCR has implemented a resolution agreement. I have not examined myself the rest of them, so I'm not opining about what they do say, but I do think that there's a data source available, and it would be well worth our time to examine what happened as a result of OCR agreements, because there are now many. So with that, thank you very much for all of you for what you have presented. I want to say we're going into our break now for an hour. Couple things. One, someone left a cell phone at the front desk. Please return and claim it if it is yours. And for those of you who signed up for public comment, which will begin at 1 o'clock, please recheck in at the registration desk to confirm your participation and receive your ticket. And there will be oral instructions given at 12:15 for that public comment. Thank you very much. We look forward to the rest of today.